Order and welcome to the Environmental Audit Committee for our one-off hearing today on the subject of water and water quality, an issue which this committee has taken a great deal of, paid a lot of attention to during this Parliament. It's become a matter of considerable public awareness and anxiety, frankly, and we're very pleased to have a panel, or several panels of senior people from within the industry and from within the regulatory bodies and finishing up with the Minister today. And we're going to start the first panel by welcoming Stuart Colville, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of Water UK, the Trade Association. Thank you for joining us, Stuart. And welcoming back Alastair Chisholm, who's appeared before the committee on a number of occasions from the Chartered Institute for Water and Environmental Management. I'm going to go straight in, if I may. We woke up this morning to reports of a significant, unpermitted, seemingly unnoticed spillage of potentially untreated sewage into Lake Windermere. And I would be grateful if, Stuart, you could address the question that the public are asking, and that is, what are the water companies doing? Why do we keep waking up to such incidents, given the amount of time and commitment that is being given to addressing this issue?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Like you, Chair, I woke up and found out about the incident probably at the same time as you did. I can't comment in any detail on that specific incident. I think it would have to be for United Utilities, the company concerned, to give any details on it. What I can say is that every water company takes any serious pollution incident, which that seems to have been, incredibly seriously. It is at the top of every chief executive's list. It is something that we are very focused on. Looking at the big picture, you've seen the number of serious pollution incidents in England fall to its joint lowest ever level last year, but there were still 44, and that is far too high. It needs to get down to zero as fast as possible. Every company.
Can you just remind the committee what a serious incident means?
Yes, of course. So a serious pollution incident is a breach of compliance in a way that produces harm. So the Environment Agency categorises breaches of compliance. It gives it a rating between 1 through to 4. Categories 1 and 2 are the most serious, and that typically results in some kind of harm, noticeable harm to the environment or humans. The number of these have been coming down quite steeply, but as I say, it needs to trend to zero as quickly as possible, and every company has a plan to achieve that.
The companies have published plans for, I think, £96 billion of capital expenditure in aggregate, currently being reviewed by Ofwat with determinations due next month. Could you characterise the 96 billion for us? And what proportion of that, or what amount of that, is towards increased capital expenditure on treatment?
Yes, of course. So since the committee's report 2 years ago, there's been a huge amount of activity from government, regulators and industry. I think the most important probably development on the industry side is, as you say, the submission of plans for £96 billion of expenditure. They were submitted in October. We expect Ofwat to produce a draft view of these in the middle of June before coming to a final determination in December. The plan, I should say, was accompanied by an apology last year from the water industry for not taking the issue of sewage spills, not dealing with them fast enough and with sufficient determination. And we held our hands up and we said, look, we should have acted far sooner on this. Hence, this transformational amount of investment that we've now put forward, 96 billion, as you say. I should just clarify one thing, which is in October, the figure stood at 96 billion. In the subsequent months, it's now increased very slightly to 100 billion as a result of further discussions with DEFRA on some of the environmental policy details. So it stands at 100 billion. So in terms of...
To be spent over what period?
So that's 2025 to 2030.
Wow.
And it's a significant increase on what we currently spend. It is far and away the largest volume of investment in Europe for any water industry. And in terms of the breakdown of that expenditure, I'll come on to sewage in a second, but I want to alight first on the fact that about 10 billion of it is for water resources. And this is important not just to secure supplies against drought in the future, but also it has a direct environmental benefit because it allows us to reduce abstraction. So within that plan, within the now roughly 100 billion, there is a proposal for 10 new reservoirs, the first of which is already under construction, 5 desalination plants, the first of which is under development in the southwest, 5 recycling schemes, as well as transfer schemes to move water around the country as well. So I don't want us to lose complete sight of this important environmental component as well. And then on the sewage side, there are a number of components to that spend. There is nearly £4 billion going into upgrading sewage works to remove phosphorus specifically. So this is where new technology gets applied to strip out some of the nutrient loading into rivers. And this is really important because phosphorus is the single biggest cause from the water industry of failures of rivers to achieve good ecological status. So that's a really important bit of spend. There's 10.7 billion specifically on storm overflows, which will cut spills from storm overflows by about 40% by the end of this decade. And we're prioritising that on bathing areas and what we call high priority areas. So this is chalk streams, shellfish areas and so on. So that will make an enormous amount of difference as well.
Does the industry have the capacity to make that scale of investment over a very limited period? Does it require, what are the likely barriers? Does it require planning consents? Does it require scaling up the supply chain? That's a huge amount of construction if it's to be mechanical systems rather than nature-based. Is there a breakdown between those two?
Yeah, so if you look at what we're spending currently, it's about a tripling of what we're spending on both sewage works and tripling again on storm overflow. So it is a big step up, and that does mean that the supply chain and the companies themselves are going to have to step up as well in terms of delivery. Now, we've looked at this really carefully, both collectively with the supply chain, engaging with them on actually what is the maximum you can deliver in any given year. We've looked at issues like how many roads can you dig up in order to upgrade sewage pipes. And we've looked at as well the balance between nature-based solutions and traditional concrete-based solutions, because sometimes by rebalancing between those two things, you can sort of maximise the amount of progress you can make. So we think it's demanding. It's about as fast as we can go, but we think we can get there, yes.
Alastair, could I bring you in? Have you had a chance to consider these plans? Do you think they're credible? Will they make a difference?
I think they absolutely will make a difference. In terms of the concerns of our membership, the biggest concern relates to the deliverability of the plans. I think Water UK has said that there's a need for an additional 30,000 people to deliver a scheme of this size. Our sector as a whole, our profession, is facing a drain of expertise and skills. There's quite a wave of retirements imminent over the next 5 to 10 years. And it is a sector that is struggling to attract enough new talent into. Also, there was a recent survey of a water sector recruiter, which showed that 70% of people who are skilled in this area are considering moving across to other utilities areas. And the biggest area of need is in those really highly experienced engineers. So I think deliverability is a real concern here.
Of course, the Tideway Tunnel is just coming to an end. I don't know how many people that employed or employs currently, but its peak, it was several thousand, I think, wasn't it?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Ian Levy.
Thank you, Chair. I don't believe it's a condition of the committee, but just for clarity, I'd like to declare that tomorrow I have a meeting with Northumbria Water exactly about this. So that's kind of why I opted, if I could, to take this question. So thank you for attending today. What have been the main causes of pollution incidents in recent years, and what steps are companies taking to deal with these incidents? And can you also comment, if you wouldn't mind, whether there have been storm overflows or the sewage discharges? And I'd like to dig into a little bit of clarity on low rates of self-reporting incidents by companies. Thank you. Alastair, do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the primary causes of serious pollution incidents, normally it's mechanical and electrical failures in things like pumping stations, treatment works, and so on. And that is often when companies don't and service teams don't respond quickly enough to alarming. And there's also, I think, we're concerned that there has been a long-term trend of inadequate maintenance, of kind of asset sweating a little bit, that has led to maybe suboptimal maintenance that means that these kinds of events have happened more in the past. Now, there is increased focus on these now, and I think companies are working hard to turn that around. On the foul sewer network, there are a major cause as well, and there the main causes are blockages. So that will come through the use of fat oils and greases and things like wet wipes causing blockages. Now, again, that's something that water companies are alive to. A lot of them have proactive cleansing programs in place. They're putting a lot more in-network monitoring. So I think if you think about the number of storm overflow monitors that are in place, about 15,000 storm overflows. I think there's about 15 times that amount of in-sewer monitoring going on so that companies can proactively identify using things like machine learning where blockages are likely to take place and then direct the maintenance. So again, it's a picture that should be improving, but maybe it's been a bit neglected in the past.
I think it's fair to say that the public do understand that things do go wrong sometimes, and we do have breakdowns and things can happen. But Stuart, ask you just if you could expand a little bit on the reporting of incidents and the low rates of reporting on incidents, because I think that's one of the main things. If people know there's an incident, if people know something's happened, and it's actual time when it's happening, they know not to go swimming in the sea. I mean, my constituency is Blythe Valley, and we are right on the coast, and people do use the sea quite a lot. So I don't know if you could expand a little bit on that.
Yes, of course. I think Alastair's right. So when we look at the data, and we're doing a lot of work on this recently, as I mentioned, it's a really big priority. The three big things we see are blockages, asset failure, and actually power failure as well, and we're taking action on all those three things. In terms of self-reporting, which is when the water company sort of says to the regulator, look, something's gone wrong here, something is not working right. According to the Environment Agency figures, the percentage of self-reported incidents now stands at 83%, which is the highest it's ever been. It's not been higher than that previously. That still means there's 1 in 5 or something that is not being reported by the water company, but instead discovered most frequently by members of the public who might be walking past a manhole or something and seeing something go wrong. That tends to be at the outer edges of the sewer network, rather than around the wastewater treatment works or pumping stations where there tends to be more water company presence. I think that will change over time. As Alastair mentioned, you're seeing far more sensor deployment, you're seeing far more data now than ever before. So I think that percentage will go up further. But as I say, it is at the highest it's ever been.
And just finally, just for that 1 in 5 that doesn't report it or is very late in reporting it, what are the consequences of that for that 1 in 5?
So the Environment Agency would investigate it as they would with a reported incident, and they would try to determine the cause, the role of the water company in that, and they have a framework to sort of have a look at it and determine the penalties that should apply as a result.
The public should keep reporting stuff as they see it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's really important that if something's going wrong, both the regulator is aware of it and the water company has an opportunity to fix it as soon as possible, because one of the big things that will turn an ordinary sort of pollution into something very serious is a delay in getting there. So one of the things that the industry's been investing a lot of time in is the creation of things like rapid response teams, rebuilding control rooms to get alerts faster, triage those alerts, get people out there as quickly as possible, and that's a really important element of this.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Barry Gardner had a quick
Very quickly, Chair, thank you. Mr. Colville, when you were talking about the Windermere incident with the Chair, you helpfully outlined the criteria for it being a harmful incident for a major sewage spill. But in the Windermere incident, the EA weren't able to visit for 13 hours, by which time the outflow had been stopped. And when the testing actually took place, which could have established harm, it's very difficult to establish harm after the event. The testing was done at the bank side of Lake Windermere, not in the centre where the outflow from the pipes had come. So surely your members should have much more attention on getting a swift response, but a swift notification to the EA whilst it's still happening, so that the testing can happen properly, and then we can establish whether it really is a harmful spill or not, a major incident or not.
Yeah, so I'd say two things in response to that, if I may. Firstly, Sampling at the site of an incident is not the only means by which you can identify harm. So there are other techniques you can use, counts of fish populations and so on, to try and analyse what's going on. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, there are far more sensors going in around water company assets now. So upstream and downstream of every sewage asset operated by a water company, there will be water quality monitors looking at 5 or 6 different parameters from ammonia, pH, temperature. And what that should allow us to do is, if something does go wrong, not only will the water company see that, but this will be revealed in real time to the world. So anyone can go onto these maps and see, well, there is an ammonia spike or there's something happening. So what we're trying to do is recognise the very legitimate concern that we're hearing that sort of lies behind this kind of question and say, well, actually, let's just be transparent about this. Let's push these maps out. Let's show the world what's happening. And we're installing the sensors to enable that to happen.
I'm just going to interject for a second. You mentioned transparency there. I think if the water industry starts to introduce transparency in the way it responds to public concerns about the consequences of spillages, that would be a sea change and very welcome. One of the reasons why there are over 2,000 investigations into water company permit breaches is because of faulty EDMs, inadequate data responses to FOI requests, etc. How do you respond to that?
So one of the reasons I think the water industry apologised last year is because we hadn't confronted the very legitimate public anger about this issue. The only way that we're going to restore trust is to lean really heavily into this transparency agenda. We have to be open about the fact, as we were hearing earlier, occasionally things may go wrong, but we have to be open and honest about that. And that's one of the reasons why every company is currently in the process of publishing a map that allows you to see exactly what's happening with all of its overflows. Water UK, as a trade body, has said it will pull that together in a way that will be of help to national stakeholders as well. And I think you'll see far more of that. We've also published an open data route map to say, actually, we've got loads of data here. Let's start publishing that for the world to see. And where that I think that will leave us is actually one of the most transparent water industries in the world at the end of this process. No other country is doing this kind of thing, but I think it's essential for restoring trust among the public.
Is that a pledge we can hold you to, or the subsequent committee can hold you to? I don't think this committee will be around by the time you fulfil it. But on to Karen Lucas, it's welcome nonetheless.
Yes, I wanted to just, thank you, Chair, follow up on that. I mean, Mr. Colville, you say no other country is doing this. No other country has the madness of the privatised water system that we have in this country, which simply isn't working. The case that we've just been hearing about in Windermere, we're hearing that the Environment Agency couldn't get there for 13 hours because it didn't know about it. So in terms of transparency, that's giving out a pretty negative story, isn't it?
So I represent not just private companies, but public companies and a mutual company as well. So I can look across all of these and see, actually, I think many of the challenges are identical for all of those industries in all of those countries. And actually, when I speak to my colleagues in France or Germany, Germany has 66,000 overflows, which are broadly unmonitored. When I speak to my French colleagues, they cannot tell me how many overflows they've got. So I don't want us to think this is a uniquely English problem, because it just isn't. I take the point that it's an unusual ownership model. Most countries do not have the system that we do, but I think that's a separate issue to the question of environmental performance.
I won't let me pursue this any further, I'm quite sure, but I do have a diagram here that shows the correlation between the sort of ownership and the sort of quality of water, and it doesn't substantiate the position that you've just outlined. But if I could ask you one other quick question about the fact that The Guardian reported in April that some treatment works are manipulating wastewater systems to divert raw sewage away from the works and into rivers and seas, reduce the cost of pumping and treatment and give the appearance of compliance. And one whistleblower was quoted in The Guardian alleging that environmental regulators know about these activities, though not perhaps the scale, and have turned a blind eye due to resourcing constraints. I just wonder if I could just ask you whether you've heard any evidence of those kinds of activities.
No, I haven't. And when I've spoken to engineers, they've told me that some of the practices that are alleged are not physically possible within some of the networks that were described. Nevertheless, I think it's right to take any allegation really seriously, and I'd encourage whoever it is behind that allegation to pass on the evidence to the Environment Agency.
I'm sure they will. To Mr. Chisholm, what contribution does poor urban drainage and highway runoff make to the current state of water quality in England? Given the public's concern about sewage discharges, is that particular issue getting enough attention? and what needs to be done to reduce the environmental damage from highway runoff?
Thank you. So, yeah, highway runoff or urban diffuse pollution is as it's categorised under Water Framework Directive, is approximately 17-18% of reasons for not achieving good status. So proportionally, it's smaller than agriculture and water, but nevertheless quite significant. There are around 15,000 overflows on the national highways network. Now, those kind of networks have generally the most dense traffic levels of traffic, and so some of the overflows from that network are amongst the most polluting. There is a situation between the Environment Agency and National Highways where they have a memorandum of understanding that highway outfalls on the national network, on the strategic network, will not be permitted. They do not need permitting. Instead, they use a predictive model to identify where those outfalls are at high risk of impact or not.
Is that right, do you think? Should it be permitted?
So we did some research recently which looked at a small number of outfalls, and one of the outfalls that we looked at was a low risk, defined as a low risk outfall using this model, and we found that polyaromatic hydrocarbon discharges, which are a priority hazardous substance under the Water Framework Directive, potentially carcinogenic, were more than 700 times the maximum allowable concentration.
Would you want to see the model changed in that case? Because it doesn't sound like it's working.
We think that the model needs to be looked at. It dates back a little while now, and we are also suggesting that the Environment Agency take a look at whether there are certain outfalls that need to be permitted, so that they will give an extra impetus to cleaning those up. There is a scheme of improvement that National Highways are operating under the road investment scheme, but at the moment it's very small. So we think it's really important that the Department for Transport gives a far more significant settlement under the next investment round for roads. In terms of local highways, again, they're really not monitored at all, and the treatment structures within local highways are gully pots within the drains that you see at the edge of the road. Given the state of local authority finances, the maintenance schedules on those kind of treatment devices are very, very infrequent, and they very quickly get blocked up and they need gully pumping. If they are full, they just simply don't work. And what you find is that you get a first flush of pollutants after a dry spell. You get the pollutants building up on the road surface, and then that flows directly into local watercourses. I think there's one other really important point on this. This pollution is often characterised as diffuse pollution, and it absolutely isn't. It's point source pollution. These outfalls they're outfalls often into small streams, and they can have really considerable impacts on the ecology of the receiving waters. So it needs a lot more attention.
Thank you. And could you tell me what you think is whether or not the current guidance and cross-departmental collaboration, for example, between the Department for Transport and DEFRA and DLUC, how effective is that guidance and that collaboration in terms of minimising problems and implementing nature-based solutions in particular?
I mean, I think the thing, if we think about sustainable drainage systems in particular, they're really good on one hand because they tackle a wide range of potential government policy activities, everything from flood risk management to water quality to urban heat island effect mitigation. That's great, that's their strength. However, the challenge is that those benefits fall across a range of different departments, and those departments have different statutory duties, they have different policy priorities that they are driving. And therefore what we have seen from experience is that there is no coordination, no effective coordination to bring these kind of devices forward at the scale that they need to be delivered. Now, if I can just give a very quick example, I visited some schemes in the London Borough of Enfield recently. They're quite a proactive borough in terms of retrofitting sustainable drainage schemes into their highways. They've installed about 250 in the last decade. They reckon they need to deliver 500 per year between now and 2050 to manage their flood risk. Now, the irony in all of this is that they're not actually a combined sewer area. The cost for an average rain garden there is about £15,000 per rain garden. If you look at the number of holes that are dug in roads in London each year, it's about 160,000. If you could retrofit even 10% of those holes with SUD schemes, you could cut that cost, that unit cost, in half, because a lot of the cost is associated with the excavation costs. If you could then factor in water company investment into that equation, you could reduce the unit cost even further. So whilst it sounds like a big number of what we've got to deliver, you can actually, through coordination, better coordination, bring the unit cost right down.
It sounds, as you say, that better coordination is going to be key, but is it enough to be relying simply on incentives for water companies and developers to implement nature-based solutions? Are there other measures that would go further than simply incentivisation, which doesn't frankly sound like it's going fast enough and far enough?
Well, one of the things that we're really keen to encourage government and regulators to look at is the idea of outcomes-focused regulation rather than output-focused regulation. So at the moment it's very much characterised in terms of you will meet certain parameters associated with treated effluent discharges or install certain numbers of monitors and so on. What we really need to do is understand what is going on at a granular level in each of our river catchments. That more granular picture of what is going on can then direct both incentives and regulations to target the biggest sources of harm in a catchment.
Do you think the balance is right between those, between incentives on the one hand and regulation on the other?
So it's not working in terms of incentivising nature-based solutions at the moment. The main vehicle for water company investment is the Water Industry National Environment Programme, which is about £21 billion, I think, of the PR24 rounds. Now that, if you read the guidance, the regulators there, they encourage the use of nature-based solutions. Maybe about up to 25% of the WINEP is greenish or a combination of the two. Is that driving the level of nature-based solutions delivery that we would like to see? I don't think so at the moment. But that's probably a balance of incentives and regulation. I think it's very difficult to say exactly which needs to come more. The challenge from a regulator point of view, I think, just very quickly, is that regulators are quite understandably going down quite a hardline regulation route at the moment. They have come in for some criticism and they are wanting to be seen as strong. Now that...
Work to do.
I couldn't possibly comment. They are therefore focusing on being seen for water companies and other polluters to get their houses in order. I do not think at the moment their regulation is targeting the most multifunctional, the most beneficial solutions for the wider environment and environmental river health.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Jerome Mayhew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to be asking questions of Ofwat about the financial sustainability and the investability of water companies in a few minutes. But just before I kick off on question 4, the ownership structure of water companies has inevitably been raised actually a moment ago, and it's in the ether, isn't there? So can you just remind me, probably Stuart, you'll have the facts of this, since privatisation, have leaks reduced by a fifth or a third?
Sorry, leakage?
Yeah.
Leakage is reduced by over a third since privatisation.
And what about investment levels in infrastructure since privatisation? Have they doubled or quadrupled?
Investment roughly doubled after privatisation. It's been maintained at a reasonably similar level since then and is about to almost double again.
Yeah, and the percentage of sewage outflows that were monitored pre-privatisation, how many were then?
About 0%.
And what is it now?
It's 100%.
And finally, just Welsh Water, which is a not-for-profit, how is their environmental performance fared compared to English for-profit water companies?
It's comparable.
Okay, thank you, that's very helpful. Just turning now to water security and water resource management. We've heard that water recycling is going to be a very significant issue, an increasing issue between now and 2050. What do we need to see from water companies? There's two ways you can recycle water: the micro and the macro. The micro is consumers in our house, how we use water as consumers, and also as businesses. The other one is macro, is how water companies recycle water. So let's start with water companies. What's the plan, and are we going far enough and fast enough?
Sure. Should I take that first? So, as I was mentioning at the start, there's about £10 billion of proposed expenditure on securing water supplies for the future. Really important issue. Within that, there are 10 reservoirs and 5 desalination plants, but there are also 5 water recycling proposals that will be taken forward. Now, this is a well-established technology right around the world, in places like Australia and Texas, in the Gulf, and so on. In some cases, internationally, these projects sort of hyper-purify wastewater and then put it straight into the drinking water system. That is not what is proposed within the UK. Most of the projects are to...
So, I've just got in there. Is that actually operated in other countries? Straightforward hyperfiltration and then straight back into the water?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Which countries is that used in?
I believe it's used in Australia, and I believe there is another proposal coming forward in Texas to do the same thing.
Thank you. Carry on.
So what the proposal in the UK, or in the English context, is to treat water and then place it into the either directly into the river or a reservoir. Now, the reason we want to do that is because it's a way of reducing abstraction. So abstraction from rivers has a profound effect on the ability of species to thrive. It concentrates pollutants if you take too much water out, and it also clearly reduces oxygen levels and the availability of water for species in that river. So there is a profound environmental argument to find the 4 billion litres of additional water that the National Infrastructure Commission says we need by the middle of this century. Currently, the way that we intend to achieve that 4 billion is a third of it will come from water resource schemes, and these recycling schemes are an important part of that, both to prevent drought and also to reduce the environmental impact of abstraction.
Yeah. But it's not just 4 billion litres of additional water, it's the geography plays a part in here. I'm a Norfolk MP, water-stressed region in the country, and Anglian Water has a plan, in fact they're already building it, a 400-kilometre water main from the Humber down to Cambridge and beyond. Can you talk a little bit about the investment required and anticipated that gets the right amount of water into the right geography?
Yeah, so there's a huge programme of work still to do. Part of that will be about intra-regional and inter-regional transfers in the way that you mentioned. So, for example, some of the projects are looking at using the old Grand Union Canal to bring water from the north of England down to the south. So there'll be a huge amount of capital spend there. There's also a lot of money going into leakage. So that will be a way of reducing demand for the water resources that do exist. We've brought leakage down by about 7% since the beginning of this decade. We're on track to reduce it by about 1 billion litres per day by the end of this decade. We're about an average performer across Europe on leakage at the moment. We want to be a top 5 performer by the end of this decade. And so part of the capital investment will be for that as well.
It's also true to say, isn't it, that water companies do not have a uniform report card when it comes to leakage. That some, in fact, Anglian, because I know them because they're my neck of the woods, they've got, I think, the best results in water leakage anywhere in the country. If the other water companies just got to the level of Anglian, what impact would that have?
It would make an enormous impact. I don't know the exact figure, but I do know that it's an important part of the way that we get to the 4 billion. So roughly 2/3 of that 4 billion is a combination of demand reduction and leakage. Anglian, as you say, has always been an extremely strong performer on leakage. It's actually helping others to achieve the same standard.
Right, demand reduction. No politician ever wants to hear that because that's voters having to change their behaviour. What do you have in mind, and how are we going to make this as painless as possible?
So I think it's a combination of different things. It's installing new equipment in homes to reduce waste. So, for example, there are particular types of shower heads. There are installations that you can put into the water supply going into the home to maintain pressure, maintain the experience of the user while reducing the water used. It's also about smart meters. So currently about 13% of households in England are smart metered. That will go up very significantly by the middle of the century. Various millions of them are going in over coming years, and that will put people in control of the water they use. They'll be able to see it in front of them, exactly what their usage is, and also give them control of their bill.
The evidence on water meters has not been uniform. My understanding is that a rich household, I'm sure that's not the right term, but a well-off household, when they install a smart meter, water usage actually goes up because they realise that water doesn't cost that much. So it's only poorer households who are having to change their behaviour as a result of water meters. Is that the right way for us to approach it?
So you're right that comparatively speaking, the charges for water are relatively low in the sense that they've come down 20% or so over the last decade. So bills have been held below inflation for over a decade. However, there is evidence actually from the Anglian region, I believe, that shows that there is a behavioural response when people see how much they're using, when they're using it, and are given opportunities to make savings as well by revealing that information to them.
Right, so we know we've got to get 4 billion litres of water a day. How far do you think the current water company business plans and water resource management plans get? Are you confident that the current plans are going to get to the 4 billion? Or is this we're going to need a bit of luck or an acceleration or a change in direction? Where do you see it at the moment?
Sure. So we've had a fairly well-established water resources planning process for quite a long time. It's been regarded very well worldwide, but I think there are now positions that it needs to evolve. It needs to be looked at and changed. I think there was a degree of comfort up until summer 2022 and that rapid onset drought. And I think that did shake the sector a little bit in terms of how confident it was in terms of its planning. In terms of where we can get to, spoken to the Environment Agency quite recently in relation to the water resources management plans. They do not foresee a situation like there is in Cambridge extending right across the country anytime soon, providing the measures that are in the water resources management plans are actually delivered. So that comes back to that deliverability of AMP8 and being able to put those measures in place.
Being able to build reservoirs.
Being able to build reservoirs. And
in the fence.
You know, it is really important to recognise that within that planning framework, at the point at which a decision is taken to build a reservoir, it then takes a decade to 15 years to actually get it in place, which is why there's such an emphasis on demand management in the short term.
So you mentioned Cambridge. Cambridge is very stressed for water at the moment. There are plans for it significantly to expand further without the water being available. And yet the earliest that the two reservoirs, either of the two reservoirs designed to help alleviate that and other water stress, can come on stream is 2036 from memory. Why does it take so long, and how can we speed it up?
They are major pieces of infrastructure. They are, very, very intensive pieces of engineering. There's also a shortage of dam engineers, actually, and a lot of these reservoirs are impoundment reservoirs, so they're not in valleys. They have walls built up. We haven't built a new reservoir since 1989, and that, again, that experience base, I spoke earlier about people leaving our sector, that experience base has gone and has dwindled. There's also planning. Obviously, there's the Regulators Alliance for, forget the rest of the acronym, but driving forward investment, and that is looking to fast-track these kind of major infrastructure schemes. But nevertheless, there are an awful lot of ground investigations, technical works to go through, and it takes a long time. I think from my perspective...
Can you make this quite quick, Alastair? I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Sure. The two need to go side by side. We've had a twin-track approach for a long time, but I think there has been a failure on delivering water efficiency. We had a Code for Sustainable Homes in place more than a decade ago. That was canned in 2015. The top tier of that was looking to achieve the kind of levels of efficiency that we're now scrabbling around trying to achieve in Cambridge. And I think it's been a real failure that those kind of measures, and again on SUDS and Schedule 3, those kind of measures have been in place and then been canned. And now we're recognising that we need to put those kind of things back in place.
Right, and that comes in under the Future Home Standard in 2025, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And that concludes our first panel. I'd like to thank Alastair Chisholm and Stuart Colville for your concise and helpful answers. Very much. Order. We'll just suspend while we...
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Our second panel, and to our panellists, right, Dr. Rob Collins from the Rivers Trust, who've been a big supporter of the work that we've been doing here, Professor Peter Hammond, who's given evidence to us before and hosted our visit to the Windrush during our inquiry in 2021, and welcome to Charles Watson, who's set up the River Action, I think, around the time of our original inquiry, but I don't think you've appeared before us before, so welcome to you as well. I'd like to start by asking, I think, Rob Collins from the Rivers Trust to give us a sense of the current state of the condition of our rivers in the UK, and if you can try and sort of separate the media concern from what's actually happening to our rivers, because there have been some improvements and then some deterioration. Could you try and paint the picture for it as of today?
Yes, so if we take English surface waters, we find that only around 16% are at good status. Not a single English river is at good chemical status. Seemingly the situation is better in Wales and Scotland, with sort of 44 and around 56% good status, respectively. But that isn't really telling the full picture, because neither country there has really undertaken a rigorous analysis of chemical status, really. It would appear that we're somewhat flat-lined here, that the next major target is 2027 under the Water Framework Directive that we still loosely follow. And it would seem that the best we can do is sort of limp along to around 21% good overall status in England. So in terms of the Environment Agency undertake classification for around nearly 4,000 water bodies, I believe, or surface water bodies. The last round of classification, around 150 improved. So over the that classification period and the previous one, just 150 improved, and there was actually something like slightly more that deteriorated, 153. So we really are flatlining. And the Water Framework Directive sets out very clearly we shouldn't have any water bodies deteriorating at all. In broad terms, agriculture contributes something like 62% to those failures, water industry something like 55%, road runoff 18-20%. Those figures add up to more than 100%, because, of course, any one water body can fail for more than one reason. The urban element, the urban runoff and urban pollution, is very likely an underestimate, I would suggest. So it feels like we're in a pretty dire situation, and it reflects years of investment. And the Environment Agency have this aspiration to reach around 77% good status by 2027, but that was dependent on around £50 billion being invested. And despite the fact the agency have shown that actually with that investment, the monetised benefits exceed those costs, we've seen just a fraction of that being invested over the last decade or two.
The last 5-year period pricing review that we're in at the moment, the water industry were setting out plans to invest 51 billion. That's the figure that you just mentioned. Is that where that comes from? Do you have a sense for how much of that has been invested thus far? I'm not sure if that's the right question for you or for anyone on the panel, but I should have asked the Water UK people before.
I get the sense that the 50 billion is actually not just water industry. It's tackling road runoff, agriculture as well. But I don't know about the water industry figure input to that. But I think it's predominantly formed the bulk of the investment thus far.
Peter, could I ask you, in terms of a similar question, in terms of the work that you've been doing in monitoring not just the Windrush, where you focus most of your efforts, but a number of other river systems around the country. Are you seeing any signs of improvement since we last spoke, the last 2 or 3 years?
I would say no. In fact, since I last gave evidence, I've been giving advice to something like 30 or 40 campaign groups around the country, and they're all very concerned about their local rivers. And I've been helping them identify how to get data, how to analyse it, and then how to do something about it. So I would say no.
And the data that you're analysing is showing a deterioration, or is it somewhat stable as?
Well, I need to separate out the monitoring of the rivers from the monitoring of the sewage works, the pumping stations, in other words, the performance of the water companies and the regulators. So my focus is more on how stuff gets into the rivers, not actually what it does in the rivers. That tends to be the local campaigners and the citizen scientists and the like who do much of that work.
And Charles, what's the perception from you're looking at this from a national perspective, coordinating campaign groups around the country. What's your sense of the current state of our rivers?
I mean, the short answer is very bad. The long answer is that everywhere you look, and I think the fact is we are learning more all the time, mainly because it is the citizen scientists who are mobilising around the country to actually provide the data. I mean, if we take a critical area for, say, agricultural pollution in the southwest, the number of EA monitoring sites in their southwest region, which is Devon, Cornwall and Somerset, have been cut by a third over the last decade. So it's the people, the ordinary people who are getting in the rivers who are telling us what's going on. So if we look at a river like the Wye, the phosphate levels, as we speak today, are at an all-time high.
We're going to come on to the River Wye action plan, I think, during the course of this session, but maybe not with you. It's coming up shortly. So two of you mentioned citizen science. Do you see, how is the Environment Agency taking data that citizen scientists are coming up with, or indeed water companies for that matter? Is there receptiveness to information being provided by people on the ground, and how is that then either changing behaviour or policy within the water company or the regulator?
I think in my experience, the Environment Agency don't want to take on board data from citizen scientists unless it's done in a very organised and more scientific fashion. For instance, like on the River Wharfe, where you've got a fellow of the Royal Society who's actually managing all the citizen scientists, making them do regular testing at the same places right throughout the year. If you're just doing sort of spot testing occasionally in your river, then the agency are obviously not going to take much notice of that.
We are moving. We're going to come on to some other questions about monitoring in a second. I don't want to steal other colleagues' thunder, but the announcement this week of additional bathing, first time, I think we've got 12 river systems being tested for bathing water status, and the government is going to be consulting on year-round testing rather than just during the so-called summer swimming season. Do you welcome that? Is that it's obviously a very modest start with 12. How do you think that could be a precursor to a much more rigorous
well, as you
system?
say, it's a very modest start. I think France has 575 bathing sites on rivers. What we know about most of those bathing sites is the water is in poor quality. But what we must remember is that there is no guidance being published by the Environment Agency regarding public safety in bathing other than those tiny single-digit number of bathing sites. And we've just completed a big citizen science exercise, which, by the way, the Environment Agency were not remotely interested in, on the Thames in the run-up to the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, where we uncovered levels of E. coli that were off the Richter scale in terms of what is safe for the public. And as the temperatures are warming up, it's half-term in 3 weeks' time, tens of thousands of families are going to be in the rivers, on our beaches, going to lakes, none of which have bathing status protections. And I'm not exaggerating, somebody is going to die because of this pathogen levels we have in the rivers, and it's nobody seems to be interested in it. Nobody is giving any. The water companies won't give any public health guidance on it. The EA won't give any public health guidance on it if it's not a bathing site. So of course we welcome a few more bathing sites, but there's nothing like the national coverage to provide the safety net to protect the public from what is going into our rivers.
Could I just add to that? At the moment, we have no monitoring of any pathogens directly. We have monitoring of E. coli. It's just an indicator. We don't know what that means in terms of, should you swallow a mouthful of norovirus or Campylobacter or Cryptosporidium, That's where we have so little information on that other than a few academic studies. So the Environment Agency don't monitor those pathogens. So that's a critical gap in our knowledge. And in terms of, we also obviously welcome further designation, but the hard work begins now. And we find it incredulous actually that these sites can be de-designated currently after 5 years if they don't reach a standard. That's a ridiculously short period of time for all the investment that will be needed, all the engagement with farmers, tackling septic tanks, all the rest of it. So
we'll be asking the Minister about that shortly when he arrives. I believe that one of the things they're consulting on in the announcement since Monday was to change that time limit, as you just indicated. Thank you. Cat Smith.
Thank you, Chair. The Office for Environmental Protection's recently reported that the government's not on track to meet the 2027 deadlines within the Water Framework Directive. So if I could start with you, Mr Watson, what actions do you think the government should be doing to try and achieve those objectives with the 2027 deadline?
Well, I think the OEP's report was very comprehensive, but I would take you to recommendation number 1. I think of the dozen or so recommendations that they put into that report, which says there just have to be additional measures. There just aren't enough measures, particularly on a catchment basis. And there is no timeline attached to those measures, but the most important of all those recommendations related to funding. There simply is not in place the funding of our regulatory bodies tasked with protecting the environment and protecting our rivers to do their job. And until that is found, and until law enforcement is properly funded and polluters are held to account and made to suffer real penalties, there will be no disincentive not to pollute.
Thank you. Dr Collins, is that something that you would agree with, or do you think there are other things the government could be doing to try and make progress towards or achieve the 2027 deadlines?
I absolutely support those comments. If we don't have the regulation, the enforcement, and the whole thing falls apart, we absolutely have to have that. And we've seen funding for the Environment Agency particularly really drop off for those sorts of resources. One thing that we've had a lot of focus on storm overflows, rightly, over the last few years, but what seems to be missed a little bit is focus still on wastewater treatment. Across most of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, all those countries have 100% tertiary treatment, high level of treatment. We don't have that here. And we know because of that, and we've provided evidence in our written evidence, we have adverse impacts upon the aquatic environment because of that. So it's not just about storm overflows. It's about we need to see much greater investment into tackling agricultural pollution, support and advice and guidance to farmers. ELMS is a start, but I think it needs a great deal more. We need to try and there are some nice piecemeal examples appearing around private investment and blended finance into rural land management, so we need to maximise those. And we need to tackle the whole thing at a catchment scale. This is the thing, we've been we really need to be holistic in the way we manage land and water. So all these, we have a myriad of plans and policies, and they need to come together at a river catchment scale. We need to identify the benefits and synergies that can come from that. And one final absolutely critical thing, not a single English river is at good chemical status. We have to have a robust, really strong chemical strategy from the government that tackles chemicals at source, has a precautionary principle underlying it, that enhances monitoring of chemicals in the environment, not only the aquatic environment, that ensures no further divergence between UK regulation of chemicals compared to the EU. There's already plenty of examples of that already. So chemicals is a huge issue, and it's been the elephant in the room almost for the last decade.
Thank you, Dr Collins. Can I take you back a little bit to the catchment-based approach? Because the Rivers Trust, alongside many of our NGOs and campaign groups, have been a bit of a driving force for improvements at a catchment scale. And I just wondered if you could tell our committee how effective have catchment-based approach partnerships been in harnessing demand for improvements and driving real change?
I think at their best, there are 106 partnerships encompassing the whole of England. At their best, they've been very successful. I guess at two things really. One is the delivery of things like nature-based solutions on the ground, but particularly the convening power they have to bring stakeholders together. So where they operate best, the river catchment scale, they cut across so many different pieces of policy and legislation: ELMS, WINEP, drainage wastewater management plans, local nature recovery strategies. That's where they can play a real key role, I think. They've been poorly resourced, so some have struggled, but others have really driven that movement towards a more holistic approach and looking for those a targeted approach to find the best solutions in the best location. But they need to be backed with greater resources and given greater legitimacy, I think. Because they have been proven, they've shown some ability to bring in funding from a diverse range of sources. So we heard about Enfield early and wetlands, where there's some wonderful examples of both rural and urban wetland systems being funded through multiple sources, through blended finance, and that's what the catchment partnerships can help drive.
What measures would you like to see from government or local authorities to support the effectiveness of these catchment-based approaches in terms of maybe defining their roles and functions, and you've already touched already on the funding, but feel free to stress that again if you
the funding. Their legitimacy in this sort of new world of generally moving towards a holistic approach, tackling things at a catchment scale. So we've got these very high level EIP targets for nutrients, and that's, well, they're an issue in themselves. They're somewhat regressive in my view, but if we can set targets at a river catchment scale, we can bring all stakeholders together and begin to think about innovative solutions. So what do we need to do for this particular catchment to reduce phosphorus so it's no longer harming the aquatic environment, ditto nitrogen and so on. So we need to have that much more local level. And that's where the OEP report, I think, is right. The partnerships need to have their role carved out, but they need to be backed with funding, and government, I think, can help with their legitimacy as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kath. Barry Shim. Sorry,
thank you.
Barry Gardner.
Professor Hammond, I think it was you, if not it was one of your colleagues there, who spoke about the lack of monitoring of pathogens in the river. Can you tell us, and coupling that up with what Dr. Collins has just said about chemicals, what sort of data ought we to be gathering? How could this committee make a recommendation that says, look, this is the data that we ought to be gathering here on pathogens, on chemicals, and this is how we should go about doing it?
I want to answer the broad question on that for the moment, because I want to get one of my pet concerns in.
And you want me to ask me a question?
Well, I want to talk about antimicrobial resistance, which I don't think is receiving enough attention. And one of the vectors for antimicrobial resistance is microplastics, and really we're not doing very much on microplastics. If you treat sewage properly, 95% of microplastics are taken out. It goes into sewage sludge, that then goes onto farmland and gets into the environment that way. However, if you don't treat sewage properly, 95% goes into river silt, then it gets washed into the oceans, then it gets into animals. Microplastics break down into nanoplastics. Nanoplastics are small enough to cross the placenta. So there are things happening to unborn children that we don't yet know about. Even the first poo of a newborn baby called meconium has shown evidence of nanoplastics. So as well as the chemicals that we should be looking for, there are issues like these bits, tiny bits of plastic, which are a vehicle, a vector for taking what are called xenobiotics.
Made that point very, very forcefully, and I'm conscious that the chair wants me to keep rigorously to time, because my colleague Selene is going to be twin tracking with me on this. So can I just pin you down, though, on data? How should the companies and what demands should the Environment Agency be placing on the companies in terms of the data that they need to ensure that water quality is where it should be and is reported properly?
No, I'm not a chemical expert, so I can't really tell you, about precise things, like persistent chemicals that come from treatments, fire retardants and the like. I can't really talk about that, to be honest. My speciality is the access to data, the analysis of the data, the quality of the data, and then the regulation that builds on top of that.
Well, what I'm asking you is how that data should be reported. What requirements should we be putting on companies? What should the EA be demanding in order to be assuring the public that it's doing its job properly?
Well, at the moment, there are plans, for instance, and someone's already mentioned, for these upstream, downstream monitoring of outfalls, especially like sewage treatment works. But my recent experience of those devices that will be used for that is that they're not very well
calibrated.
Well, they need regular calibration, but not even cleaned properly. So, and water companies actually are using them now. Wessex have been using them for 10 years in the treated sewage that comes out of sewage works. And I monitored 2 million samples of such measurements. These are the spot samples that at the moment are just done monthly. And did you know that less than 50% of all treated sewage is ever monitored? They only monitor between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. in the afternoon.
Professor Hammond, you're giving me a deeper analysis of the problem. You're not helping me and the committee arrive at the sort of recommendations that would give us a solution. Let me turn to Dr. Collins, and of course I will come to you, Mr. Watson. Mr. Collins, one of your colleagues, I think, at the Rivers Trust, Tim Harris, although he doesn't speak for the Rivers Trust in this capacity, but he did spend, I think, 18, 19 years as an advisor to United Utilities. He recently told LBC that water companies have significantly underestimated the number of sewage pipes in operation. That's to say that even if we were putting monitors on the pipes that the companies have identified, which is about 22,000, I think, he's saying there could be up to 10,000 unmonitored pipes that the companies simply don't know where they are. And that's because of poor record keeping over a long period of time. Does that chime with your understanding?
I understand that point, and I think it's valid. I can't comment on the actual quantification of it, but I think for sure.
I think he said, in fairness, he said that a range between 20 and 50%, so it could be up to 10,000. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. No, I understand that is the case. I can't comment on the particular numbers.
So on the 20-odd thousand pipes that we do know where they are, what data do we need from them?
I think the question is broader than that. I think if we take the chemicals, there are around. The evolution is that we follow the Water Framework Directive, and we have around 45 what are called priority substances, the nastiest chemicals. And it's a catch-22 because there are only 45 or so of them. They come with a standard, a concentration that has to be met in the water, but isn't. But because of that, we don't really monitor all the other hundreds, literally hundreds, very well. So there could be pesticides, personal care products, pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, hydrocarbons, all of that, industrial chemicals. We don't measure that with, collectively, the Environment Agency, water industry, very well.
Are there good examples that we can follow?
I think, well, in Europe, the problem is it's all driven by the 45. So they come with the regulation. So everything else there's this catch-22 of, well, we keep a watching brief on some of the other things, but what the Environment Agency do with the other hundreds is to collect a water sample, run it through a machine, and the machine tells them presence or absence, which is something, but it doesn't tell us what the concentration is. It doesn't tell us whether the concentration is harmful.
We're not getting a comprehensive view.
No, we're not. We're not.
Mr. Watson, I know you wanted to come in.
Yes, I mean, you wanted a simple suggestion.
Please.
Monitor E. coli. Because if there is E. coli in the water, you know there's going to be a load of other stuff with it. But it is coming out into the rivers. All the progress that's been made in monitoring has been about sticking devices onto outflows because previously there was dishonest reporting by self-monitoring by the water companies. So all the progress that's been made is and now we've got these wonderful things like live sewage discharge maps, so we know when these things are discharging, but what nobody is telling us is what lies beneath the water. Now take the River Thames, where there isn't a bathing site, but thousands of people use that amenity. Members of the public, children, families, rowers, swimmers, use that amenity. Nowhere along that river is anyone officially, we are, well, we shouldn't be doing this. I mean, the mere fact that we are having to do it is an outrage. The fact that we had to put out public health warnings at the time of the boat race and give the participants guidance on what to do is outrageous, but nobody else was doing it. So test for E. coli and issue regular public notices along the river, irrespective of whether it's designated one of our 7 or 8 to be bathing sites, to keep the public safe, because the public is not safe.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring in Matthew Ofwat very briefly on the back of that, because I think you're a Thames swimmer.
Well,
good luck.
First of all, well, you raised the point about someone's going to die. Actually, I was swimming in Shillingford on Sunday, and there was turbidity in the water, and I'm aware of the Bathing Water Directors and what they actually test for. But I'm aware that there's viruses, parasites, fertilisers, pesticides, pharmaceutical products, nitrates, phosphates, plastics, fecal matter, and even radioactive substances. So what would you say would be the main cause to human health in regards to those? And you've already made a comment about good luck with that.
You're very brave to swim in the Thames. The answer is people like us should not have to be doing. We're the only people doing this. Nobody else is doing this. Nobody else is monitoring this terrible situation. This should be done by the people empowered, the Environment Agency, to protect the public. 2 weekends ago, there was a whole range of documented evidence of piles of human excrement washing up on the river in the lower Thames. It was all over social media, along with all the other horrible things that come out of the pipes. And all Thames Water did in response was to say, we've been and visited, we don't think it's us, we think it might be agricultural waste, where there aren't herds of cows in Putney or Hammersmith. And that was the only, the EA didn't turn up, there were no dead fish, the EA will only come if the dead fish, most of the fish have already been killed, so there's little chance of them coming to see the dead fish. But that is the situation. Nobody is providing us with the protection.
I'm afraid I'm going to need to move us on, and I'd like to welcome Selene Saxby, who's joined us from the EFRA Select Committee.
Thank you. And can I just clarify on this point around E. coli, that you've obviously just differentiated that it's not always human, and might you agree that in the data that we look at, that we ought to be able to separate so that we get a clear idea of where some of this waste has come from?
Well, interesting. There's some there's a very interesting report about to come out from Cardiff University, I believe, which is looking at the actual origin of algal blooms on the River Wye. And with things like eDNA testing, you can actually trace a lump of excrement back to the actual species that produced it. So all the technology is there. There is wonders of technology available. It's just they're not being availed of.
And do you think there is a risk that because we're only testing at the bathing water sites, that there is a presumption that it is the same quality as a swimming pool, and that therefore we're actually concerned that there's two different things going on here? One is about the ecological quality of the water, and the other is it safe to swim in, and that they're not always exactly the same. Particularly, I come from a very rural area where we have a lot of cows, so we have a lot more issues with runoff from farms than other areas. Do you think there is a concern about the data almost having mixed messages from the way in which we're reporting it at the present time?
It requires scientists, funded scientists, to answer that question. But all we do know, perhaps we should talk about the anecdotal evidence. Since we've been publishing this, every day we get dozens of incoming emails of people reporting how they got ill. They swam, they went rowing, their kids went rowing, they had a cut, people getting sepsis. All we know is there's a terrible problem, and I think as volunteer organisations, all we can really do is highlight this problem, and in the hope that somebody somewhere is going to come and sort it out.
Professor Hammond, can I come to you as a fellow mathematician and just say, if you had the opportunity to design a test data system, you might need to write to us afterwards with the detail on this, but what data would you be looking for, providing, And, you know, would it just be around EDMs, or would you be looking for more?
Well, unfortunately, the most recent work I'm doing shows that EDMs are not very good, and we're putting a lot of emphasis on them, too much emphasis in my opinion. For example, I'm just doing an intensive study of Severn Trent water, 200 sewage works. It's the biggest thing I've ever done, and this is information that on treatment of sewage and when the sewage spills occur. This data was not given to me by Severn Trent Water. They refused. This was given to me by the Environment Agency. And what I've found is that the sewage treatment data, which can measure volume, for instance, which this committee wanted the government to adopt, are very reliable. But the EDMs, 55% of those data series I've analysed so far, I'm halfway through, are inconsistent with the treatment data. So they're unreliable. Now, if you include the unreliable data in your analysis, for instance, of compliance with permits, you get that Severn Trent have breached their permits thousands of times. If you exclude that unreliable data, you get hundreds. Now, that means that the classification, for instance, Severn Trent as a 4-star outstanding company is based on very shaky data. So I'm very concerned that we're putting so much emphasis in the future on these EDM monitoring, but we're actually we're using the wrong technology, basically. We should be using volume, and then we get a much better idea of what's happening. Now, if this is repeated across the other 2 water companies that the agency have given me a lot of data for, I think it will be a scandal if the unreliability is at the rate of 50%.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just follow that up? So this committee called for monitoring in the receiving waters, upstream and downstream of outlets, as we've just been talking about, and the government has been consulting on has agreed the 4 parameters that will be tested. Do you have a view, Peter, on the reliability of that? It doesn't include biology, which is what Charles was calling for with E. coli. No. But do you... Will that, if you've mentioned some concerns about the quality of the sondes that will be used, although they haven't yet, I think, assessed exactly what will be used. They're still consulting on that as well. But the parameters themselves, will they give us a better indication of the impact of the quality of the water in the receiving bodies?
Well, if they work, yes, they will. But I believe that actually they're not going to work very well unless the water company put a great deal of effort into managing them, into keeping them clean, because you get detritus in rivers that generally starts to clog up the devices, and you also have got to calibrate them regularly. So I just worry about the accuracy of the data.
And you're saying, are you suggesting that the way in which they've looked after the EDM monitors, which are within their facilities, has not been good enough, so that the unreliability...
I think it's scandalous. I mean, I think it needs a public inquiry.
Well, that's an interesting comment to make, something we can consider when we write to the Minister. Thank you. We must, I'm afraid, move on to Cherilyn McCrory for the last session on this panel.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions, if I can, particularly on the agricultural runoff. Mr Watson, could you explain what changes you would like to see, particularly around intensive livestock? We're going to go into the River Wye things a bit later, but if you wanted to use that as a bit of a case study, but how can we ensure that intensive livestock units are well regulated, well operated? What changes need to be made?
Well, as we know, it's a huge problem. I mean, we've just published a report on the dairy industry where, I mean, the majority of dairy farms in England, 67%, and 80% in Wales, were in breach of regulations. But we're not actually blaming the dairy farmer. A dairy farmer today, due to the intensification of the industry, intensification driven by the fact that they now only have they have no choice as to who they sell their milk to. The supermarkets now control the entire procurement process. So a dairy farm today has to put twice as many cows on the same hectarage as it would have had to have done 30 years ago in order to break even. So it's double the amount of excrement, and it's worse than that. It's not double the amount of excrement because a dairy cow also, due to the pressure to intensify, now yields twice as much milk as a single cow as it did 50 years ago, and that is primarily because of the soy, the feeds, the intensive stuff that gets sort of shoved into them to produce more milk. And so that is producing, it's very similar to the sewage problem. There is an infrastructure that has not been invested in, that is old, antiquated, taking far more demand, far more volume due to intensification, and then with things like more extreme weather, it is collapsed. And so that there is the problem. So these farms have to be helped. If we're going to keep them, if they're going to remain viable, they have to be helped.
Sticking with dairy, have you seen good practice on dairy farms that we should be aiming for the rest?
Well, dairy farms that are farmed extensively are by definition good practice, because it doesn't have that concentration.
Or changes
of manure.
in facilities. Then I'm looking for solutions.
Yeah.
Again.
So the facilities have got to be upgraded, and your average dairy farmer can't afford it. There's 7,500 dairy farms in the country. Half of them are smallholders, and half of them are tenants. And so take for example the new slurry management grants that the government has introduced, which is a very good idea. The problem is they've got to match fund them 50%. So if you're a tenant farmer, you can't afford the 50%. So there's no means testing on those grants. But the amount of money available, it barely touches the sides.
Now, are we seeing some of the, in the capital investment, are we seeing any of the infrastructure costs covered in the new farming grants that come with different capital investments? They introduce different things from time to time.
Not enough. So, for example, one of the biggest polluters on a dairy farm is silage. Sorry, it's getting very technical, but silage is not covered. Repairing silage clamps is not covered in any of these grants. So the grant scheme has to be made more inclusive of other forms of infrastructure, and it has to be bigger, and it has to be more affordable for the smaller farmers if we want to keep small tenanted farmers. So that is but the biggest answer to your question is regulation. Regulation of agriculture is done on an advisory basis. Now, when we started River Action, a farm would only be inspected every 275 years based on the number of inspectors. Now, we welcome hugely the fact that the EA has now recruited a load more inspectors, and a farm can probably be inspected every 30 or 40 years. I mean, it's still crazy, but anyway, it's better than what it was before. So more farm inspections are taking place, but the basis of inspection is advisory. So we are currently in a judicial review against the Environment Agency, where we have called out the fact that the most critical regulation within the farming rules for water, which says you must never overload soils with more nutrients than what soils or crops can naturally absorb, that is deliberately and consciously not being enforced due to guidance issued by DEFRA.
Right.
And by not enforcing that key regulation, that is why the soils of a catchment like the River Wye, where you've got this huge concentration of intensive poultry, now carries several times the phosphorus loading that the crop or nature that naturally exists there can ever take it. And I'm afraid, Chair, it's moving to your constituency now. The number of intensive poultry farms in Shropshire are higher than in Herefordshire, the largest concentration of any county in the country. And no consideration has been taken of the impact of this, the concentration of all this poultry in one single area. So
then we're going to come to the River Wye, so I won't steal other people's questions. Dr. Collins, if I can turn to you, the target for the environmental impact plan's target to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment pollution from agriculture is by 40% by 2038, using a 2018 baseline, but there seems to be some confusion what that 2018 baseline looks like. Can you provide any information on what farmers are using for their baseline in order to be able to show what success looks like?
I don't think farmers know what the baseline is.
So how are we ever going to measure?
Exactly, that's something we made in our written evidence. I'm not entirely sure what the baseline is. It comes with some modelling, predictive tools, but exactly what it is I'm not entirely sure. And the requirement to reduce will vary by catchment, depending on the nature of land use, land management and a whole load of physical characteristics. So it's one of the challenges of that particular target is that it's not clear. Sediment particularly is really hard to quantify, so we need to fully understand. There's some modelling behind it, and that may be fine, but understanding the uncertainty around that and conveying that to farmers is a huge challenge. Yeah.
And if we could turn to some of the practical solutions, the environmental solutions that are coming through now from DEFRA. I have regular roundtables with my farmers. It seems like the schemes are becoming more streamlined now and a little bit easier to access. How engaged have farmers and landowners been with you guys, with your local trusts, in order to try and You know, they see that they sit on a catchment that needs to be helped. How engaged are we finding farmers?
Our trusts are well engaged with farmers and increasingly in cluster groups as well. So groups of farmers across a catchment, a landscape. So that's good news. But I think, and we welcome, you know, ELM and some of the, you know, the slurry management grants and so on. All of that's good news. But I think, A, it's not nearly enough money, is probably the frank answer. And secondly, we have a concern about how it's all targeted. I mean, over here, your problem might be soil erosion and particular phosphorus. Over here, soluble nitrogen. Are we sure from these voluntary schemes that we can target the right solutions in the right place? And that's one real issue we have.
The targeting, the onus is on the farmer, isn't it, to decide what is best for his business.
Yes.
And based on what he still needs to do to produce to make a profit. And as we've heard, it's very difficult for farmers to be making a profit at the moment. So how much engagement is there? What does the conversation look like when their end game might be slightly different from yours? How do you manage that?
Well, I don't think it necessarily is. I think there's lots of win-wins to be had. For example, I think Charles mentioned earlier about the level of phosphorus we have in some of our cultivated soils is at or close to saturation. Where we, and it's not just rivers, just other people engage with farmers, where that happens, those farmers, we can advise and say, well, actually, there's a win-win here. There's no point you putting on any more phosphorus in whatever form because it'll simply get washed off. So you save on the farm business and the environment saves. We don't eutrophy the local watercourse. So where that advice is given, that's all well and good. It's where it's very piecemeal out there. That's a problem. Often farmers don't have access to advice or they have to pay through the nose for it. And they're also in a very challenging position economically. So it's very piecemeal. Our challenge is that we need to see a much more harmonised approach to this advice and target it in the right place.
So targeting better targeted advice, I guess, as well. What are the barriers do you think we need to overcome? What recommendations could we make to DEFRA to improve the schemes to ensure we'll get to the right end?
I think you could target schemes better. So buffer strips, for example, or whatever, geographically they can be targeted much better, I think. That makes a lot of sense. There's some overarching things that encompass so much of the cultivated land, like too much phosphorus already, our soils are saturated. So soil nutrient testing should almost be universal. It is in Northern Ireland, more or less, as I understand things. I don't quite understand why it isn't elsewhere. So those are two clear pieces of advice. The other one is that where steadily there are, again, piecemeal examples of blended finance coming in for farmers for things like nature-based solutions, and they are an incentive for farmers. There's finance involved, but we won't see a step change where some of those potential investors are concerned about where the regulatory baseline lies. So if they don't fully understand that, they don't want to fund measures that farmers should be taking anyway. This is sort of over and above.
And then do you provide feedback to farmers? So if you're planning to, do you regularly test the river catchment where their farmer sits above? So if they've been in the scheme for sort of 3 or 4 years now, are you feeding back? Are we seeing improvements? Can you give that motivation?
Yes, and that's exactly the benefit of working at that local scale. So you know what the problems are as manifest in the river, working back up and engaging with farmers and helping them find solutions, helping them find funding to address the issue. That's the key to it. It's at that local level.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our panel. I'd like to thank our panellists, Dr. Rob Collins, Professor Peter Hammond and Charles Watson, very much for joining us. Order. We're going to suspend quick...
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order, and welcome back to the Environmental Audit Committee for our third panel on our session on water quality today. We're very pleased to welcome from Ofwat, David Black and Paul Hickey. David, I'm not sure if you were listening to the earlier sessions, but one of the things that came up was the fact that you're currently reviewing the business plans for the water companies for the next 5-year pricing period. The figure of 100 billion was mentioned by the Water UK representative. And questions were raised about whether or not the water companies, with this significant additional investment, will have the capacity, both in terms of financial resource and physical capacity through contractors to be able to do the work. Are you trying to form an assessment of that? I mean, there's a limit to what you can tell us, I appreciate that, but could you characterise your view of the scale of the ambition?
Sure, thank you, and an excellent question, and thank you for the opportunity to join today. So yes, the business plans water companies have set out, have proposed around £100 billion of spending over the 25-30 period. And that's a significant step up from the level of investment at any previous price review, and that's largely driven by ambitious plans to invest to improve environmental outcomes. And that does raise for us a number of questions, but you're right, it does raise questions about the ability of the sector to deliver on the scale of investment, the ability to finance it, and then the ability of customers in terms of affording the consequent impact on bills from the increase of investment. So we are examining that. We will issue our draft decisions for consultation on the 12th of June. We will set out our determinations for each company and the level of costs. So what we're very interested in is are companies putting forward efficient, well-backed plans. We're also looking to see their evidence that they can deliver on those plans. So as part of providing their business plans, we asked their boards to sign off and to assure that their plans were backed and credible to deliver, as well as that they had the financing in place to deliver on that. And so we are looking at these plans. We'll put in place protection for customers. So if companies do not deliver, that funding would be clawed back and companies penalised. But equally, we're looking to see if there's anything we can do in terms of helping the sector to gear up to deliver. We've already taken steps. So, for example, we've allowed accelerated investments. We've given an early approval so companies can start on some of the environmental spend well ahead of 2025.
In our report in 2022, we recommended to the government that as part of its strategic guidance to Ofwat, you should be encouraged to encourage the water companies to use nature-based solutions as an increasing measure, a tool for improving wastewater treatment. What focus is there on that in these plans, or can you give us any insights into the extent to which you're trying to follow that mandate?
Sure. So we've taken direct steps ourselves and then worked with the sector to try and promote nature and catchment-based solutions. We don't see enough of them. We'd like to see more. So what we've done is made sure that our regulatory framework provides a level playing field so that companies can choose between conventional and nature-based solutions. It's true that not every case a nature-based solution will be appropriate. And then there's a question for the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales as to whether the nature-based solution or catchment-based solution will meet their requirements. And so that tends to be the driver of companies' decisions whether to go with nature-based approaches or not. But we've also introduced new measures in the price control, so we're measuring the impacts on biodiversity and trying to ensure that companies can capture in their business plans the broader benefits that these solutions bring. So we think it is an area of priority. I think our concern is we still think the sector's got some way to go in this space, but we're very clear as a regulator that we'd like to see more of this, and we're doing everything in our power to encourage those solutions.
Thank you. Lewis.
Chair. Mr. Black, after 30 years of privatised water, we find ourselves not only swimming in our own excrement, but we find ourselves drinking it as well this week down in Devon, and the cryptosporidium outbreak that we've seen this week. So given that, are you confident that the model of privatised water, given that it can't even ensure our safety in our own rivers and bathing waters, our own drinking water, is the correct model and vehicle for being able to deliver water security given an existential threat that the climate crisis represents to this country?
So the question about the model in terms of public or private is a question for the government rather than the regulator. So we regulate companies financed in a number of different ways, so from the not-for-dividend model in Wales to listed companies in England and private equity-owned companies in England. We can obviously look across the border at Scotland and Northern Ireland and with experience with publicly owned companies. I guess in terms of looking at evidence, in terms of in Scotland, we see Scottish Water as leakage performance, as I would understand it, is worse than any company in England. And on sewage discharges, they don't measure most of their storm overflows, but the ones they do show use 4 times the level in England. So it's not clear to me in terms of evidence base that looking elsewhere that the answers are necessary in the ownership model. You're absolutely right, the sector faces key challenges in adapting to climate change and in improving the environmental outcomes. It's very clear that the state of rivers, that it's not good enough where we are now, and that requires major investment. The sector has financed £200 billion of investment since privatisation, so it can do that. What we need is good data, which you've just been hearing about, and ambitious goals to drive and improve performance. And we're confident that whatever model that we have, provided we've got ambitious goals, we've got accountability, and we're clear about what we're trying to deliver, the sector can step up and deliver, but it's no question that it's going to be extremely challenging.
So let's look at the investment that's been talked about. It sounds very good on the surface. So I think it's £96 billion of extra investment. But if we look at the figures for the last 30 years, we find that the cumulative total of dividends extracted since privatisation is 77.6 billion. And over the period up until now, it's 191 billion of investment. That sounds reasonable on the surface of it, until you begin to realise, like the new investment of 96 billion, it's us, the bill payers, that are paying every single penny of that investment. In fact, when you come to the owners of water and sewage companies in this country that own our privatised water system, they, since 1990, over 33 years, the shareholders of those companies have invested less than nothing. Now, that comes from David Hall, visiting professor of University of Greenwich, who's done a study on this. That's not very impressive investment levels. And I'm looking at this 96 billion. We're paying for that. None of those companies that have sucked out 77 billion are paying a single penny towards improving our very poor water system, are they?
So in terms of the facts, so there's around about £200 billion invested since privatisation, you're right. In terms of the level of dividend payments, that's around £52 billion based on Ofwat data, so we don't recognise those higher numbers. That said, since privatisation, in terms of the way the model works, is investors pay for the investment up front, and then that's recovered from the cost from customers over time. And so you're absolutely right that over time customers will pay. So on average, for £1 of capital investment, that's paid for by customers over about 30 years, like any other investment proposition. And so the benefit from a customer perspective is they would have to pay much more up front. So if you had to pay the capital investment up front, bills would be higher now than they would be if it's recovered over time. That's the way the model works. And in terms of, so the sector has, there has been a significant investments in terms of the level of investment of the sector. So the level of assets at privatisation of companies was around 9 billion. It stands close to £100 billion today, and around about £65 billion of that has been raised from debt, and about £35 billion have been from shareholder funding.
Just my final question, Chair, in terms of the challenges of the climate crisis. I live part-time in London because I work here, and Thames Water provides my water. As far as models go, Thames Water doesn't seem to be exactly a poster boy or girl for the industry, and yet we find that Thames Water, which inherited a debt-free company, now owns £14.3 billion of debt. Just as models go, I know you talked about Scotland, you talked about Wales. I mean, if you could see this, these are the multiplicity of holding companies that constitute Thames Water. I count 8. That's all I can count. There's probably more on there, and they've taken out £14.3 billion of money in debt. They've been servicing their dividends from borrowing against the assets. Is this a model that's working to provide clean, drinkable water in this country and is fit for purpose, given the climate crisis that's coming our way, that this is fit for purpose to provide our water and our water security in the future? Do you really think that, as the regulator?
So, just in terms of the facts, so it's true that Thames started at privatisation with no debt. They had assets of £1 billion. They have assets of £19 billion today. So the key ingredient in terms of the difference of the level of debt, they were debt-free at privatisation. They had assets of £1 billion. They have assets of 19 billion today and debts of less than 15 billion. And so, we're absolutely clear that Thames is not performing the way it ought to be. We're clear that its finances are not in the state that it ought to be. We've been clear about that for some time. It's very clear the company needs to improve its operational performance. It needs to improve its impact on the environment. It needs to improve its customer service. And they need to raise fresh equity finance. So, it's very clear that Thames need to improve their performance. But if you like, the privately funded model has meant that there has been a growth in assets in London of £18 billion over that 30-year period.
Thank you very much, Clive. Now, I'm conscious that we've got the Minister arriving at 4. We've got 3 sets of questions, 18 minutes, that's 6 minutes each. Barry Gardner.
Yes, but in response to Mr. Lewis, Mr. Black, you would have to acknowledge, would you not, that the level of gearing in Thames Water is 80%, that is debt to the value of the company, whereas actually your own recommendation is that the gearing of a company should be about 60%. Why have you allowed that to happen?
So absolutely, we think the debt levels of Thames is too high, and we think that Thames's performance reflects those stretched finances. So we would, and our model works on the fact of around, we would suggest a level of gearing around 60% would be better from a...
You're repeating the question.
Yes, sorry.
My question was, why have you allowed it to happen?
So the choice about the choice between debt and equity finances has been the decision of investors in the company within a framework set by Ofwat. So we have required them to have a minimum level of investment credit rating. But I would agree that I think Ofwat should have
exercised... Their credit rating was downgraded, I think, twice in the last year.
Sure, and so that will lead to consequences in terms of them being prevented from paying further dividends out of the company. But
you know how they got round that very well. They got round that by making a repayment of the debt through their holding companies, exactly the Byzantine structure that Mr. Lewis just showed us. So that's not really an answer to the question, because the way in which you're able to constrain the company is not actually able to pierce that corporate veil into Kemble Water and all the other holdings above.
Sure. The control over dividend payments, however, does actually address the ability of their ability to take customer money out of the company, and so that's ultimately what we're saying. But you're absolutely right that we are concerned about the financial resilience of the sector, and we will look at further measures if required to ensure that companies do operate prudently. Ultimately, the question is about the consequences of the financial structures are visited upon investors, and that's what we see at this present point in time. Thames's struggle to raise its finances are about Ofwat holding the company to account, and those consequences falling back on investors and not on customers.
I want to ask you about the level of trust between Ofwat as the economic regulator and the businesses themselves, not specifically Thames Water, but all of the businesses, because we've had submission from Stuart Colville, the Deputy CEO of Water UK, which is, if I paraphrase, somewhat critical of the demands that you're placing on them in terms of the upcoming price review. I'm sure you've seen that, so I won't adumbrate it.
Well, I certainly won't apologise if water companies are criticising us for challenging them too hard. That's part of our job. We're here to protect customers' interests. It's absolutely right that we challenge companies to do better. It's very clear that they have lost the trust of the public and that they need to turn around their performance and improve it. That said, we regulate all of those companies and we engage with them. We have free and frank conversations with them, and we work with them in a whole variety of modes. So
it's a robust and professional exchange.
Indeed.
Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you. And when can we expect the outcome of your investigation into the sewage treatment works? Because I believe that was due at the end of March, wasn't it? The end of the first quarter, you said.
Yeah, so we don't operate to a fixed timescale on these investigations. So what we have done is we've got 6 companies where we've got enforcement action underway. We've issued what we call a minded to decision to 3 of those companies. That was back in March. It was back late last year. They have then the opportunity
to... But the proposed decisions were expected to be published for public consultation at the end of March.
Yes.
So don't tell me the things that I don't need to know about, just answer the questions I do, because the chair is really pushing us for time today.
So I would like, I'm very keen that we publish the outcomes of these decisions.
When will it happen?
As soon as we can. We are aiming for summer. So that's...
No. Summer is
indeed
as bad as telling us it's going to be the end of the first quarter, and then here we are at the end of April. We need more specifics, don't we?
We are striving to do this as soon as we can, but we're equally very clear that we have to produce a legally robust decision. We may well be challenged by companies. We want to be in a position that we can hold companies to account, and we have an obligation to do that as a regulator. You'll understand.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Barry. Claudia Webb.
I mean, just to follow on with that, it'd be fair to say that the investigation that you're referring to is actually a criminal investigation. Is that right?
No. So Ofwat doesn't have criminal investigation powers on environmental matters. The Environment Agency has got a parallel investigation, and they are undertaking criminal investigations. So our investigations are civil investigations.
And the Environment Agency is undertaking the criminal investigation.
Right.
How do you deal with any how are you working with the Environment Agency on the price review 24 package?
So we work closely with the Environment Agency. We have a whole range of engagement with them. In fact, my colleague here, Paul Hickey, leads our RAPID group, which is effectively a vehicle for Ofwat, the Environment Agency and the Drinking Water Inspectorate to work collaboratively on water resources. In terms of the way the price review works, is the Environment Agency sets the environmental requirements on companies. They then produce business plans with in this case, 17,000 environmental schemes. They present those business plans to Ofwat. We engage with the Environment Agency in terms of about the extent to which companies have met or not met the Environment Agency's environmental requirements, and then we act as the economic regulator to check and challenge the efficiency of the company's business plans and protect customers from paying twice or paying excessive amounts for the environmental improvements.
Are there any potential conflicts of interest?
No, I don't think we have complementary but separate roles. So the Environment Agency is, the clue's in the title. It's there to protect the environment. It's our role to protect customers' interests, but customers' interested in environmental outcomes as well. And so, as the government's strategic policy statement to us requires us to take account or give effect to the environmental requirements set by the Environment Agency. So when you see, for example, the outcomes of the price review, you'll see a very large investment programme, which is in large part being driven by the Environment Agency's statutory requirements.
Just in terms of the proposed customer bill increases, just declare that I'm the Member of Parliament for the constituency Leicester East, which covers Severn Trent Water. In my constituency, income levels are 10,000 less than the national average. Severn Trent Water proposing an increase of 37.16% in prices, in bills. To your knowledge, what are companies doing to persuade their customers that the proposed increase in bills are justified? And do you think those bills are justified?
So we'll issue our draft decision on that on June the 12th. So they'll set out our view as to whether the company business plan, whether they have justified their bill increase. So we'll be looking at their costs. Are they cost efficient? Are they well justified? Does it stack up? We'll be looking at the returns that they're asking for. And then we're also looking at the affordability support they supply for the customers. Because you're absolutely right that many customers are hard pressed. The idea that they can afford another £20 a year on their water bill is going to be very difficult for many customers. So the sector does provide at the moment support for customers via a social tariff, but we really need to see that step up, and we need to see support made available to the consumers who cannot afford to pay their water bill. So there's an element of both the check and challenge on the package, making sure that every penny of the bill increase is justified, and then making sure that companies are stepping up to provide support for customers that are most in need.
And because I don't know, I'm the question that Mr. Lewis posed in relation to Devon. I mean, I assume that Devon is covered by, and those in the room can tell me, by Southern Water.
Southwest Water.
Southwest Water is proposing, Southern Water, where does that cover? Because Southern Water is proposing an increase of 65%. Thames Water and Southern Water have admitted that they have not mapped their entire sewage networks. What confidence can bill payers have that companies' proposed investment plans for their sewage networks are properly targeted and will deliver good value for money? I can't understand a level of increase at 65.98% for Southern Water and 39.64% for Thames Water, and yet they haven't even monitored their sewage, mapped their entire sewage networks. How is this justified?
So that's the very question that we're looking at now, and I say we'll publish our answer shortly. I think you make a very good point that in terms of we would expect companies to understand their networks, we would expect them to understand what's driving their costs, we would expect them to be able to demonstrate to customers that their plans are efficient and robust. And as part of our price control, we'll also rate each company's business plan as to the level of quality and ambition. And so when you see us publish our views on companies' business plans, we'll set out our confidence, if you like, in terms of the quality of that company's business plan as well. And we'll be very clear about what we're expecting the companies to do in terms of addressing any issues. So, i.e., where they need to provide further evidence to us to demonstrate that what their proposals are good value from a customer perspective.
Chair, I know we're pushed for time. I'm sure the public would have expected us to ask more questions of Ofwat, but I know we're pushed for time. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. We've got the Minister arriving after we hear from Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you very much. You've said in one of your earlier responses that the water companies have lost the public's trust. This is one of the most heavily regulated sectors in our economy. It's regulated by you. So they've lost the public's trust whilst being regulated by you. Are you concerned that the public should rightly have lost trust in your organisation as well?
I think that's a very fair question. We think the sector needs to do much better. And it's very clear that the environment...
I'm not asking about the sector, I'm asking
yes,
about Ofwat.
Sure, yes. And so we've looked very hard in terms of the way that we regulate. I think it's very clear that the level of environmental performance of companies needs to improve, and so we've looked very hard at the way that we work with the Environment Agency to make sure that is the sector going to deliver on the right environmental outcomes. You'll have heard from the Environment Agency recently the steps that they're taking to improve their performance. What we think we need to focus on as a regulator is making sure that there's a greater focus on the strategic direction of the sector. We don't think the sector's been focused on the long term sufficiently. One of the challenges we face in the sector is that these issues are very real today, but they do take investment, they do take a long-term plan to fix. The second point is about driving performance of companies. So when we look across the sector, for example, in 2022, 3 wastewater companies had 0 serious pollution incidents. That's exactly as it ought to be. We wouldn't expect a company to have a single serious pollution incident. Yet another 2 companies in the sector, the poorer performers, accounted for over half of the 44 incidents in the sector. And so what we would like to do is drive up the performance of the poor companies to match the best, and then encourage the better companies to perform. We've introduced changes such as the Innovation Fund to try to get the sector to innovate more. We are very clear about the need to deliver stretching performance improvements, so we will set challenging performance improvement targets at the next price review. And then the challenge alluded to by the Chair at the start of the discussion was about the ability of the sector to step up and deliver this enormous level of capital investment in the next price review period. And we're very focused in terms of what we can do as a regulator to hold companies to account. I think, in terms of what we need to do differently, we need to be closer to companies in terms of understanding what's going on in their businesses and the ability to step in early at when we see poor performance signs of that occurring.
I'll come on to financial resilience in a moment, but that was a long list of all the good stuff you think you ought to have done. That's the future. It does not bear comparison to the actions of Ofwat over the last decade. Do you accept, I'm not asking for a mea culpa, well, it would be nice, but I'm not going to ask for that. I'm just saying, are there reasonable grounds for Ofwat to pause to reflect on its regulatory performance over the last decade?
We certainly look to learn lessons from all of our experience, and so whenever we go through, we regularly do that. I think in terms of the issues around storm overflows, it's very clear that not having accurate data on what was going on was vital, and so I think that's one key lesson to learn. So getting accurate data on company performance is important. I think getting, as I say, a stronger and better view of what's going on inside other companies. We've been a relatively small organisation. We've relied on price controls. The steer from the government over time has been to be very mindful of the compliance costs that we impose on firms. So I think we really need...
Consumer has been paramount, perhaps too much so.
Yeah, I think that the final point I would make is actually about the system of planning in the sector. So there's a lot of work goes into plans, so I'm not diminishing the efforts of many in the sector to do that. But the question is about, if the level of environmental investment at this price review is 4 times that of the previous price review and the price review before that, and the price review before that, how did the planning system work? How do we miss the level of investment that's required? How does the planning system work? And I don't think it's the question about the focus on bills, actually. It's the question about how does the planning system work? Are we anticipating the challenges of the future? We've talked about climate change, and how do we make sure the sector is investing today to benefit the future?
We've got a quadrupling of the investment requirement for these companies, and that and other issues have led to a degree of financial resilience concerns. So what are you doing to protect the consumer and to assess the resilience of companies?
So, yes, there's clearly some real questions about the financial resilience of particular companies. So the first thing we do is make sure that there is a good, transparent understanding of the financial issues going on in companies. We monitor what's going on. We engage with them. We're pushing them to secure new investment into their businesses. And since 2020, there's been £4.6 billion of new equity raised by water companies. So accessing equity markets is important. And we need to make sure our regulatory framework, while being tough and challenging on companies, is also one that's going to be sufficiently attractive to attract new investment.
There's a balance, isn't there? Because we're requiring a huge amount of investment. That's private money, not public money. There needs to be a regular and predictable rate of return. Not overly generous, but sufficient to attract that investment, whilst at the same time not burdening these companies overly with debt and financial engineering, which is what happened in the noughties. So there still seems to be, despite the increased powers that you have, that dividend policy isn't as clear as it perhaps should be. And what are you doing where you're not confident that dividends are based on financial performance and environmental performance?
Just slips.
So we've introduced a new licence condition. It's come into effect last year, and that will require companies to demonstrate that when they pay dividends, that's linked to performance for customers and the environment. Prior to that, there was no requirement. There was no legal requirement on companies to do that. We're reminding companies of their responsibilities, and companies will be hopefully more aware of those responsibilities when they make decisions, but more importantly, if they do not make decisions which demonstrate that dividends are linked to performance for customers and the environment, we will take enforcement action to ensure that stops.
Given the very bad press that this sector has had, the increased oversight that they're receiving from you, are you confident that the sector remains financially attractive and that it is going to receive the inward investment that we all expect?
Yeah, and so I think that's a challenge. You've spoken about getting that balance right, and I think that's one of the questions that we think very seriously about as the regulator during the price review period, and we have a number of mechanisms, if you like, for testing and challenging that. We think in terms of from an investor perspective, the sector's reputation is important as well, and so that's clearly been a negative factor. I think we've seen companies struggle to meet their performance commitments in the current period, and again, that's been a detriment on their returns. So if you like, from an investor perspective, they haven't done very well in the last 3 to 4 years, and you might say the sector hasn't done very well, and it's absolutely right that investors should see their returns are affected by poor performance. So when we set the price review for PR24, we'll be setting out in terms of like that balance of risk and return to make sure that the sector is going to drive better outcomes for customers, that returns are linked to performance, but also to make sure that the sector remains an investable proposition.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Could I
just Barry, very quickly.
On that question of trust that Mr. Mayhew challenged you, Mr. Black, do you think that looking at the revolving door that there was over a long period of time between senior directors of Ofwat, then becoming senior directors of the water companies themselves, that is something which undermines the public's trust in the regulator as being really impartial, objective and fair-minded?
So we're very clear in terms of all employees of Ofwat are subject to business appointment rules. So when they leave, if they're a senior employee, they need to declare where they're going and get approval for that. In the case, I think that's often referred to of Catherine Ross, a former chief executive. She left Ofwat to work for BT. It was 3 years before she came back into the sector. We're very clear in terms of making sure that there are no conflicts.
She's not the only one. I mean, there have been many others who've
maybe one or two a year.
Senior roles.
Maybe 1 or 2 a year over the last 30 years, Barry. It's for a 300-person organisation. It's not. So I think it's absolutely right that that's important that Ofwat staff are, above and beyond a reproach, and we have strict rules around that. They continue to be applied, and we certainly follow through on that.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our panel. I'd like to thank David Black and Paul Hickey for joining us today. We'll have a quick break while we await the arrival of the Secretary of State. Order. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. Welcome back to the Environmental Audit Committee for our fourth and final panel of the day on the issue of water quality. We're pleased to welcome Robbie Moore, Member of Parliament and Minister, relatively recently appointed Minister for the Environment covering water, and he's joined by David Hallam, who's the Director of Floods and Water in DEFRA. Minister, you will have heard on the radio this morning, as did we, the very unwelcome news of the very significant spillage of sewage into Lake Windermere, seemingly undetected by the water company or by the Environment Agency for a number of hours. How do you react to such news reports, given your present role, and what are you trying to do to get on top of this issue?
Well, I think the first thing to say is this is a completely unsatisfactory situation, and I would expect a full investigation to be carried out, as is the case. I've spoken with my Environment Agency colleagues today, specifically from hearing the news on this, and also had a call with the Chief Executive of United Utilities as well to get her undertaking of this. But there is an investigation that is happening as we speak, so therefore it would be inappropriate for me to comment any further specifically whilst that investigation is happening. But what I would absolutely expect is, once that investigation is concluded, if there is, as may come to light, wrongdoing in this case, I'd expect the Environment Agency, as the regulator and the enforcer, to carry out their absolute obligations as that regulator and that enforcer, and carry out appropriate penalties, fines, whatever it may be, on the back of what's happened.
There are currently over 2,000 instances of alleged permit abuse by water companies, 6 water companies, and we've heard from the regulator they've issued an interim advice note to 3 of them. Are you able to give any sense of whether we can expect a whole lot more coming down the track? Are other water companies who have not been investigated likely to be for other similar permit breaches? You just mentioned this may be a permit breach. We don't know yet. But how are you trying to get on top of that in your departmental role?
Well, as I've said, with regards to Windermere, there is an ongoing investigation with that, so I think it's fair to let that investigation happen. But what I can absolutely reassure you and the committee is that on a rolling basis, I meet with the chief executives of all of the water companies in my office, and we go through performance-related metrics. We look at things like pollution incidences, we look at service interruptions, we look at financial standing of water companies, and I question them and hold them to account, and that builds on the work that not only I am doing with my officials within DEFRA, but also the expectations that I would be anticipating the regulators to be undertaking, as in the Environment Agency and also Ofwat in their respective regulatory roles.
We've heard from Water UK that the industry is looking to commit up to £100 billion through the 5-year business plans currently being considered by Ofwat, and that's close to double the previous 5-year period of investment, much of which is going into water treatment, but also covering their other responsibilities. To what extent do you attribute that increase in investment to public pressure, to government pressure to change, or to regulatory pressure to stop this from happening, stop the spillages from happening?
Well, our expectation on water companies is absolutely to enhance their asset base where they have ageing assets, and also deal with, quite rightly, the challenges associated with storm overflows and pollution instances, as we would quite rightly expect. And this builds into not only the legislation that we brought out with the Environment Act, but also our plan for water, which is all about more investment within the sector, stronger regulation and tougher enforcement. And part of that more investment, we have seen over plans approximately approximately £100 billion that are being allocated by water companies through the price review of 24, which is currently being scrutinised by Ofwat. That process is taking place as we speak, as you would have heard from Ofwat, as I'm sure. And there is an expectation that that specifically addresses some of the pollution instances which are taking place, of which my understanding is, of that £100 billion that has been put forward collectively by water companies, approximately £39 billion of approximately £10 billion of that is specifically to relate to storm overflow improvements.
We heard that from the Rivers Trust that currently 16% of rivers achieve good ecological status. The target under the Water Framework Directive been taken through through the Environment Act is to achieve 77% by 2027, which is only 3 years away. We're not going to make it, are we?
It's absolutely our ambition to make sure that we're getting and reaching that 75% target. It is worth noting that the data sets that the OEP looked at were from 2019, and we have made significant improvements at the speed in which we're wanting to roll out our plan for water to ensure that as a government we are putting ourselves in as best position as possible to meet that requirement. It is right to say from those 2019 figures, 16% of rivers were at that good ecological status. And just looking at how those measurables work, there are 21 tests that are associated with good ecological status, looking at everything from specific pollutants, from arsenic, copper, manganese, zinc, right the way to fish, how river systems work. And of course, if there is one element of those 21 tests that doesn't necessarily meet good, then all of those tests effectively sit at the measurable below, which would in this case be moderate. So we know that because it's all in, or if one of those tests is not met, all of them effectively fail. And we know that 20% of those that are rated moderate at the moment, just one of those is just holding all of those 20% from reaching that good status. But nevertheless, we are aware of that and we are dealing with it, which is why through our plan for water, we've rolled out a strategy which is focusing on more investment, stronger regulation and tougher enforcement. And if I may, Chair, I just want to reiterate some of the key measurables that we've put in place since 2019. We've announced a action plan specifically for the River Wye, which was £35 million that had been allocated. We have specifically said that all fines and penalties that are collected from water companies now are ring-fenced through the Water Restoration Fund, which allows us that money to be specifically ring-fenced back into improving water quality measures. We've announced £11.5 billion through 180 catchment-based projects, and also dealing with some of the agricultural challenges, phosphorus or nitrate, allocating £75 million to improve slurry infrastructure. But we will not hold back in holding those to account who pollute, which is why we have removed the cap on penalties from $250,000 to an unlimited amount, and that money that is now collected gets reinvested through the Water Restoration Fund. We've quadrupled Environment Agency inspections. We have given the Environment Agency more money, and we are allocating 200 staff to specifically carry out inspections and have more of a relationship with water companies in terms of holding them account and making sure that they're meeting their requirements. We've announced a whistleblowing portal, and we've also increased the amount of monitoring that we're doing from 7% of storm overflows in 2010 to 100% now, which gives us an ability as a government to understand where we allocate resource. And we have specifically said to water company bosses, if there is a serious criminal breach, they will not be able to receive bonuses. And we have also stipulated to Ofwat that dividends must be related to environmental performance. And as you may know, Chair, £150 million has been collected in fines and penalties from water companies since 2015.
Thank you. We've heard in previous evidence that some of the event duration monitor data is extremely unreliable, and we don't have the facts and figures about that yet, but hopefully that will be forthcoming, and we will want to draw that to your new officials' attention, because even if I accept 100% of EDMs are now in place, But if they're not working, then it's difficult to claim that we've got 100% coverage. I'm going to move on to, we talk about, you touched on agriculture, and I think Chris Chope has got some comments on agriculture.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the DEFRA announced in January that it was designating catchment areas where wastewater works must be updated. And in the policy paper accompanying that announcement, there was a commitment to complete a limited exemption process by the 1st of April this year. That didn't happen. It hasn't happened. I raised it at a meeting with you. You recently wrote to me, I think on the 9th of May, saying an announcement was imminent. Why has the announcement still not been made?
Well, I'll bring David in as my official, but I want to reassure you, as I hope I have done at previous meetings that we've had, is that we are working at speed to try and make sure that those announcements can get made at the earliest opportunity. David?
Just to add that we are moving as fast as we can to finalise that list. We have designated all the sites, so now it's a question of finalising the list, given that some companies did ask for exemptions, and that will be in a few weeks. Chair, could I just pick up on your point about the event duration monitors? Because I don't know what you've been told, because I wasn't in the room.
You can read the transcript.
I will. I look forward to it. There are some alternative facts put around the reliability of the monitors, but the fact is that 86.5% of monitors operated for more than 90% of the time last year. So the vast majority of monitors are operating properly and all the time.
Well, this was a specific allegation in relation to analysis of information provided by one of the water companies, which suggested that only 55%, I think it was the figure over the period that was being considered, were actually operable. So I think you'll need to look at that before you seek to contradict it. Back to Chris.
Mr. Hallam's answer to my question is most unsatisfactory, because the Minister has just written to me saying the announcement is imminent. You've referred to several weeks before the announcement. The commitment was originally for the 1st of April. I was told then by officials that the reason it couldn't be announced before the 2nd of May was because of purdah around the local elections. The local elections are behind us, and now we're being told that there's yet more delay coming down. Do you not realise that the impact of this delay is having upon all those people who are concerned about investment in wastewater treatment plants?
Yeah, and so, Christopher, I want to reassure you and the rest of the committee that there were challenges, as unfortunately is the case when local elections are taking place and mayoral elections, that the purdah period kicks in. I want to reassure you that, and the rest of the committee, that there will be a work being done at speed to make sure that announcement is imminent, and we will ensure that I, in my ministerial role, working with my officials, will make sure that that is absolutely the case.
So would it be before the Whitsun recess?
Well, as I say...
well, surely anything after the Whitsun recess is not going to be imminent.
No.
And it wouldn't have been imminent on the 9th of May either, would it?
No. And what, again, just coming back, I want to reassure you and the rest of the committee that we are working at speed to make sure that announcement can be made imminently.
So will it be before?
I would absolutely hope that is the case.
You're in charge, yes. Aren't you in charge?
I absolutely can assure you that it will be made imminently, that announcement. And if Whitsun recess is waiting far too long, imminently is the answer.
And can I ask you specifically about the River Avon? Because one of the consequences of the attempt to try and mitigate phosphates in the river is that you can buy phosphate credits. But phosphate credits vary in price significantly, depending upon the location in that particular river catchment. And for technical reasons, people who want to buy phosphate credits in my constituency in Christchurch have to pay 8 times as much for those phosphate credits as if they are up the river at, say, Fordingbridge, further up the river. Why is that? How is that tolerable? And how does it fit in with the government's policy?
Well, what we are absolutely keen to explore is where there are challenges within different river catchments, within the same river catchment, those challenges are being presented, and the price of the units are changing within that specific area. We want to make sure that there is consistency across the approach in the way that policy is rolled out and being applied to the market.
So why are some phosphate credits more expensive than others? Surely we're talking about the need to reduce phosphorus, and why should some phosphorus be more expensive than other bits?
Well, again, I will let David come in if he wants to comment, but there will be external market conditions that relate to the environmental benefit that is attached and associated with certain credits that are encompassed within the catchment environment. But certainly from a policy point of view, we want to make sure that there is consistency that is rolled out within each catchment area where this applies.
Do you want to say something more about
I'm
this?
going to say to offer to write to you with an explanation of that because I don't have the details of that scheme.
Okay, so another cop-out. But can I just ask you this? Why wasn't the River Avon chosen for an action plan, and why was the River Wye chosen instead?
So there are particular challenging circumstances with regards to the River Wye, which I can go into. That was an announcement that we made where £35 million has been allocated to the River Wye Action Plan. We are, as a department, looking at additional catchments that we can roll out similar types of schemes based on the challenges that exist within other catchments. Each catchment, as you'll appreciate, is different in terms of the phosphorus or nitrate challenges. Others and further announcements will be forthcoming in due course about additional catchments that will be specifically.
Okay, a quick final one. You talk about the environmental benefits of all these policies. Do you see it as an environmental benefit that there are houses in my constituency which are ready to occupy? The applications for bin store approval is being made to the local authority. The local authority says they can't approve the bin stores until, in respect of each unit, you've paid £40,000 for phosphate credits. Is that really environmentally sensible to keep houses empty in these circumstances?
Well, I mean, again, I know that we've had specific conversation about this in regards to your constituency. Again, I'm more than happy to meet with you in regards to the specific challenges that you're facing in your constituency and provide further explanation. But this is something that needs to be considered alongside DEFRA and also DLUC colleagues, which we are working closely with to make sure that we get the strategy right, so we can unlock houses that either are forthcoming for development or those that are sitting empty at the moment.
Can that be imminent, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Sir Chris. Just on before we move off agriculture completely, there were, in relation to the River Wye action plan, I think you've just indicated that this is perhaps an initial plan and that other river catchments are likely to demand similar plans, and I think that your response to suggest that that's something the department's willing to consider is very welcome. One of the elements of the River Wye action plan in relation to the new money is that I think it's primarily tied into either poultry litter or slurry arrangements, and I would urge you to consider having a pool of money that's available to whoever is responsible for delivering the action plan to determine what's the best use of that money, rather than the department predetermining the best use of that money prior to completing the plan. And one of the things that is very welcome within that plan, and I speak as a farmer but not a riparian owner, is that the buffer strips around the waterways are being doubled and in some cases I think quadrupled, and farmers are getting significantly increased support for creating buffer strips. I think that is probably the single most effective way to minimise livestock pollution and runoff from phosphates which have been spread on fields. So I very much welcome that. I want to get that on the record for you. The other piece of evidence that we've just heard earlier today was one of the problems from spreading human sewage sludge, which contains microplastics and nanoparticles of plastic that have not been removed through the sewage treatment works, although we heard that 95% do get removed, that spreading such material on the land allows those particles to get washed away into the river systems and thereby into the ocean and there into the food chain. And I would urge the department to consider what needs to be done to try to encourage water companies to remove the residual plastics before consenting for material to be spread on the land. Don't expect you to comment on that. I just wanted to get that across. I'm very pleased we're joined by Selene Saxby from the EFRA committee, who has some questions now.
Thank you and good afternoon. Very pleased to hear your announcement earlier this week about the new bathing water sites and consultation on testing. And as you know, I have a particular issue in the frequency of bathing water testing in coastal locations. And I wondered if you had any plans within the consultational review or looking at reviews to the frequency of testing and also the differentiation between freshwater and coastal, because obviously the overflows in a river environment are going to be tested upstream and downstream. But at the present time, there is no testing whatsoever when we have an overflow event in a coastal location.
Yeah, thank you, Selene. And as you'll be well aware, we've announced another 27 new bathing water sites this week, which takes the total number up to 451 in England across beaches, lakes and rivers. And I was pleased personally that there's an additional 12 rivers that have been included within the bathing water sites. And that was obviously part of the announcement, but also sitting behind the announcement in terms of new additional bathing sites were some of the reforms that we're now looking at doing to the regulations that sit with bathing waters. And I'll just run through those because I just want to provide reassurance to the committee that from the experience that I have had as a minister representing Ilkley, which has the River Wharfe in, which is the first river to be designated as a bathing water site, and having dealt and interacted with other stakeholders, we want to look at making sure that the regulations are absolutely fit for purpose from a practical perspective. So we do have river sites and beach sites that are unfortunately classified as poor, and currently, if those sites are classed as poor consistently for 5 years running, they automatically are de-designated. We want to look at changing that so that automatic de-designation does not take place, so that we can ensure that we are holding those polluters or making sure that the resource goes into ensuring that the quality is significantly improved, and that will take longer than that 5-year period. We're also looking at reviewing the period in which bathing water applies. At the moment it's from the 15th of May to the 30th of September, and we're wanting to look at widening that potentially beyond that to better suit the usage at those bathing sites, because I know that you're a keen surfer and I suspect that you surf beyond those bathing periods. And also looking at the number of monitoring sites that we have at each designated site. At the moment it's just one in a specific location, and we're wanting to look at whether it's reasonable to have more than one monitoring point at each bathing water site as well. And the other thing that wanting to do is, maybe picking up on your point, is looking at taking into account water quality before a bathing water is designated. At the moment it is simply based on usage, and I think it would be far more reasonable and actually far more practical if we had a better understanding of the water quality before a designation is implemented. And that is actually so that we can get as good a plan in place to make sure that the water quality is improved from whether it's poor to sufficient or even from good to excellent as part of that process.
So the point I was making with regards to frequency of testing, was delighted that we might be able to extend the Victorian bathing water season to the actual swimming season, and the actual issues around the frequency of testing. So at the moment it's tested once a week and the data is released a week after, but if you have an overflow event at the weekend, we have this situation whereby the Environment Agency then say that water is safe to go into after one tidal rotation, yet Surfers Against Sewage say it's 48 hours. And this inconsistency of data and the safety, we've had evidence this afternoon at the risk of somebody is going to die in one of our rivers. Now, I feel there is a real need. I recognise that this is now confusion between DEFRA and DCMS because it's for the usage of the water as opposed to the quality, but they rely on your data. What are we actually going to do to start testing frequently enough so that people can know it is safe to go in the water?
Well, what we're absolutely wanting to ensure is that data is being collected and from these specific designated sites, that the Environment Agency is getting that information out there to the users as much as possible through SwimFo, and having as real-time information being put out there as it is specifically in relation to bathing water sites at the moment. But I know that you put forward that 10-minute rule bill earlier this week, which one of those points that you raised specifically about the different challenges of different types of pollution. And again, as I've committed to already to you, more than happy to have that further discussion with you. But David, I don't know if you wanted to comment further on the types of pollution instances that Selene is referring to.
I will just add, Minister, if I might. I'm a keen outdoor swimmer myself, so I recognise the concerns. The chair of the Environment Agency and the chief executive gave evidence to this committee and were asked the same question, in fact, and they pointed to the modelling that they do and that they feel it's good, and it does provide a real-time forecast of what the pollution is likely to be, and they don't necessarily agree with the surface against sewage approach, which is just to say a blanket, it will be for the next 48 hours. But they did say as well that they're very committed to continuing to improve the monitoring and the modelling so that it's as good as it can possibly be to give bathers and other recreational users the best possible information.
In a user-friendly format, I hope, when we get there, because I think that is the challenge, is that the data is very embedded in the Environment Agency website. Whilst it's very detailed and thorough, it's not there in a real-time app format, so that you, as you don't know if you swim regularly, it would be nice to know before you went that it was safe to go. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Selene. Matthew Ofwat. I'm sorry, not Matthew Ofwat. No, you already. Do you have something you want to say?
I do.
Yes.
I do have to correct you, Minister, that you say there's real-time publications of swimming locations. That is simply not correct.
I was meaning actually, and sorry about that, in regards to forecasting that the Environment Agency are putting out there.
Because the system as it currently stands means that the Environment Agency have no legal requirement to advertise what the condition of the bathing is. It's actually a requirement for the local authority who decide that they are not going to get involved in that political argument. And the outbreak on Harlem Beach last year, that Minister Powell is certainly aware of, because the two of us were in there. We know how the system actually works on the ground. But you say that you don't have any plans, you said you do have plans to change the testing. Some of us have been frustrated for many years when we've heard minister after minister tell us that bathing water quality is getting better in this country. But the system that you use to test the water is in many ways redundant. So you did say that today is the first day of the bathing water season today. So happy bathing water season. So that means that the last 226 days there's been no monitoring at any location across the United Kingdom. And the bathing water season is only 139 days long. Now, you quite rightly say that the water is analysed and it's measured against the previous 4 years, and that means that you can then designate a bathing water location. But where Selene actually was incorrect as well, the Environment Agency are required to take up to 20 samples. They don't always do that. In some locations, they only do it 5 times a year. And so that means over a 4-year period, they may have tested the water just 30 times. So if you bathe all year round, that's probably 2% testing of when you swim. So when will you actually make changes? Now we've left the European Union. I'm very aware of the EEC 76160 Bathing Water Directive intimately. When are we going to make changes to the Bathing Water Directive so it's fit for purpose?
So, as part of the announcement that was made this week, we are looking at specifically those reforms, specifically, as I was saying, in response to Selene, in regards to the dates. So at the moment, you're quite right, that bathing water period is from the 15th of May to the 30th of September. We are, as part of this week's announcements, wanting to look at reviewing that and making it better suited to usage. We know that people are using bathing water sites sometimes throughout the year and sometimes beyond those dates. And therefore, in my view, through, the bathing period in which the monitoring takes place needs to better reflect that. And therefore, that's why we have announced that as part of this week's announcements. In terms of the quality of our bathing water sites, they have improved since 2010. So in 2010, 76% of those sites were rated good or excellent. Last year, that was increased to 90%, and that is despite in 2015 the regulations getting tighter and more stringent. We still managed to make sure that bathing water sites that were classified as good or excellent improved to 90%. And as at 2023, 96% of all bathing water sites were classified as being sufficient. So the water quality overall has improved, but as part of the reforms that we've announced this week, we are wanting to look at providing more flexibility to the dates associated with them. And also, what I didn't mention just in response to Selene, was looking at also the definition of bathers. Because at the moment, the regulations relate to if you're effectively swimming, but we know that people are paddleboarding, kayaking, canoeing or surfing. And therefore, because the regulations at the moment work based on effectively usage, which drives monitoring and investment, we want to make sure that the usage is absolutely fit for criteria, so therefore we're able to ensure that that investment and monitoring can be sufficiently put in place. And the final point that you mentioned there was in relation to the amount of times which the Environment Agency are monitoring these sites. Well, I can absolutely confirm to everybody that whether a bathing water site is classified as excellent, good, poor, sufficient, that the Environment Agency is absolutely meeting their statutory requirements under the bathing water regulations in terms of the amount of monitoring that they're carrying out. In fact, they at the moment are averaging 3 times more than what they're actually statutorily obligated to do in terms of the amount of assessments that they're carrying out of the bathing water sites. And that data enables us as a government to allocate funding and hold those to pollute to account. And I will give you an example of a river system that I know very well in my own constituency, the River Wharfe in Ilkley, which has a designation of poor. But because it has been designated, we've been able to push Yorkshire Water to put a significant amount of investment into Ilkley. £15 million that they've spent recently in terms of upgrading the capacity within the sewage treatment process, and allocating another, I believe, £38,000 in addition to the sewage treatment work. So having this data enables us to be able to not only carry out the monitoring, but ensure that the investment is put there to demonstrate that the improvement in water quality can also be followed through.
Congratulations. You've just repeated everything I've heard in my 14 years of being a Member of Parliament about bathing water quality. And you fill me with no confidence.
Well, hopefully...
It's just incredible that you come along. There are simple ways of getting around the Bathing Water Directive, as I know, and I'm sure you probably know as well. And that is you determine when you take that sample. You can take it at locations and at times that you know that there's no overflow. There's no running water through rain, for example, at times of storms, and you can ensure that the tidal stream is in the correct position so you don't get a reading that you don't like. Secondly, you can also reject a reading if you don't like it as well. And you say that they've been undertaking the number of samples that they are required to. Yes, they are. But the amount of samples they're required to take are so low, it is simply useless in taking those kind of readings.
The regulations work on a basis of usage, and that's how it's been identified. And that's why I don't feel that they are fit for purpose going forward. That's why we have made this week's announcement on making sure that we are going to review those 5 points that I've gone through to make sure that the bathing regulations are enhanced to better meet the usage and meet the different types of environments that bathing water regulations are being applied for. You know, we've only just seen them being started to apply to rivers within the last few years, and we've had 12 that have been additional river systems that have been approved this year. So it's right that we get the regulations to practically work on the ground.
Okay, moving on to rivers. At the moment, under the Bathing Water Directive, there are just 2 areas that are tested: E. coli and intestinal enterococci. But that doesn't actually test for other pollutants. We've heard that there's viruses, parasites, fertilizers, pesticides, pharmaceutical products, nitrates, phosphates, plastics, fecal matter, and even radioactive substances. The tests that the Environment Agency undertake, both in the Bathing Water Directive and indeed on the rivers, don't address any of those conditions. So how can you start by addressing the risks of chemical pollutants and antimicrobial resistance when you don't know what the baseline is?
So the bathing water regulations, as you quite rightly say, specifically mandate the Environment Agency to carry out those two tests, and as they do, meeting their statutory requirements. What does happen under the Water Framework Directive is there are 21 tests that are associated with good ecological status, of which those 21 tests, as my understanding, covers all of the points in terms of the measurables that you've mentioned there, plus others, in addition to fish, invertebrates, even down to how the river channel has been altered through mechanical means. And those assessments are done in relation to good ecological status under the Water Framework Directive, as well as there is good chemical status that is also referenced under different tests. So there is bathing water regulations that relates to one set of tests, which are specific monitoring points where bathing water designations take place. But then in addition to that, all rivers will be looked at under the Water Framework Directive, where there are up to 21 tests that look at good ecological status.
Okay, finally, some of these new bathing sites that are on rivers are going to be downstream of sewage outlets. So we were discussing earlier about swimming in the Thames, which I did on Sunday, and it is possible to see sewage outlets. Many of them are actually illegal, but they are still there. So how are you going to impact, how are you going to mitigate some of these sewage outlets to ensure that the Thames, I hope, meets bathing water standards?
Well, we have already brought it out made sure that all storm overflows are now monitored. It was 7% back in 2010. We're now 100% monitoring of storm overflows from last year. So having that data available to us enables the Environment Agency to do their job as the regulator and the enforcer, where permitting requirements are not being met by a water company. But it also enables us to make assessments on where the level of resource and investment needs to go in through our plan for water, which, as I've said, is all about making sure that there is more investment that is going in where pollution incidents are out there, where the pollution instances take place, and there is tougher enforcement and stronger regulation that is being brought out, which is what our plan for water is all about. In regards to bathing water sites that are downstream of storm overflow outlets, as you've referenced, that the whole purpose of which, if those new 12 river systems that have been announced this week, after the monitoring takes place, if they are designated as poor, then it will enable more investment to be specifically put in to make sure that those sewage outlet, the storm overflow outlets, are meeting the minimum, the expectation that we would expect those water companies to meet, so that we can put in plans better investment, better levels of resource, and deal with the problem to ensure that the quality of those designated bathing sites is improved.
Are you proud that we've designated 12?
Yes.
Well, Netherlands has 33, Germany 38, Italy 73, and France 573, and you think 12 is a proud achievement?
Well, of course, we can only deal with applications that come into the department, so I am proud that, given that it was only a couple of years ago that we had the first river that was designated in my constituency on the River Wharfe, we now have 12 rivers that have been designated this week. I would encourage many more to come forward if we receive those applications based on the new reforms that we are bringing out through our regulations. But what I can say is there is a huge amount of appetite out there. You know, we had a consultation period in which fed into the 27 bathing water sites that we announced this year. I think as a department we had about 10,000 responses to that consultation, which clearly demonstrates, quite rightly, that people care about the quality of water, which is why we have been so robust in accelerating the measurables, the resource, the investment through our plan for water, which is all about and has at its heart improving water quality.
And finally, have you ever swum in the River Ilkley?
I haven't swum in the river in Ilkley, no.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, I'd just like to place on record to the Minister that I'm proud that 3 of the 12 river systems that have secured bathing water status this week are in Shropshire, 2 on the River Severn, 1 in Shrewsbury and the other in Ironbridge, which is on the edge of my constituency, and 1 on the River Teme in Ludlow. And I'd like to pay tribute to Alison Biddulph, who led the campaign for all 3 sites, and I'd like to set down a challenge to other members of the committee to encourage campaigners in your constituencies where you've got natural bathing water sites to get them engaged, because the Ministry has responded very well, and I thank you for that. And I'd also like to say that the River Teme, the application went in after Severn Trent decided in January of last year that it should be part of the Get River Positive scheme, in which they're investing, in the case of the River Teme, £7.5 million in improving their water treatment assets, and including, I believe, at least the first tertiary treatment of a wastewater treatment plant that it will be operational in this country. So one of the reasons why those of us in Parliament get engaged in campaigns to improve the quality of lives for our constituents is to make a difference, and I think this committee has made a difference, in particular, I'm pleased to say, in this issue and in my constituency and in Shropshire. And having got that off my chest, last questions from Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Chair. I don't think there's any doubt, Minister, that the public have a real appetite over improving the quality of our water. I don't think that's in doubt. I think what's in doubt is whether or not this is a government that can actually provide that and is providing that. Because notwithstanding the reassurances that you have tried to give the committee over the past half an hour or so, just last week the Office for Environmental Protection reported that effective evaluation programmes for both the Water Framework Directive regulations and the 2023 Environmental Improvement Plan are simply not in place, making it almost impossible to effectively scrutinise progress in improving water quality. So how does the government plan to improve progress monitoring to ensure that water quality targets are met?
Well, I can say one of my first meetings as a new minister coming into the department in November last year was with Dame Glenys in her role as chair of the OEP. And working very closely with the OEP is incredibly important. We need to make sure that that relationship is established well, and we are responding to all reports that are put out by the OEP. And we will absolutely respond within the 3-month period that we are obligated to do to the OEP's report. I think it's also worth noting that since the OEP report was done in 2019, we have, as I said, made a huge stride in wanting to accelerate what we are doing in terms of improving water quality.
I'm not talking about that OEP report. I'm talking about a report that was published just last week. So what it said in 2019, that data is not the data that is in question at the moment. So what I want to know is what you're doing in terms of both the report from last week, but also from a report that was published in January 2024, which covered the period April 2022 to March 23, where the OEP said that the scale and pace of delivery of actions is not aligned with the objective to achieve good ecological status or potential by 2027. And it said the river basin management plans indicate low confidence in achieving that. So the period in question there was between 2022 and March 2023.
And I thank you for that clarification, but my understanding is even the report that you're referring to, and I'm happy to write to you and the committee with further information, is related to data that was given to the OEP that relates to 2019. And it is important to note that not only have things changed through the plan for water that we've brought out, but what that didn't take into account is the £100 billion that's been put forward by water companies over the next price review period for the next 5 years, of which 10 billion of that specifically relates to upgrades that are anticipated over that period of time for storm overflows. Neither does it take into account all of the work that has been done through the environmental land management schemes, whether landowners have entered into sustainable farming incentives, countryside stewardship schemes or landscape recovery schemes. of which many of those schemes have options available to those landowners and agreement holders to improve water quality. And one of the big changes that has taken place since that report came out is actually the landscape recovery schemes, which is a huge shift in terms of trying to get landowners to work collaboratively together with the sole remit of improving water quality. And what I just want to say here is previously, under any agri-environmental stewardship scheme, a landowner would have a direct contractual relationship with Natural England, for example, which was based on certain management options that they put in place. But if other landowners were not involved in a scheme, then that didn't necessarily improve or help to benefit as much as what one would want to see the water quality being improved within that wider catchment. So through the landscape recovery schemes, what it does encourage is landowners within that catchment area to work together collaboratively as part of an agreement in a partnership approach to improve water quality. And the OEP's report doesn't take into account quite yet those measurables in terms of improving water quality.
It seems to me that it's problematic either way, isn't it? Because if it is really the case that a report published by the OEP in January 2024 is based on data from 2019, if you're right, and I would be very grateful if you would clarify that in writing afterwards, then to be dealing with data that's 5 years out of date would suggest there's something wrong with the regulatory system that's being used, surely, because we're talking about changes that are needing to be made pretty urgently. And if we're basing that on data that's 5 years old, then how does that work?
The OEP will, of course, be carrying out another report based on 25 data, which will be obviously as up to date as it can be at that time, and that will take into account the significant improvements that we've rolled out as a government through the Plan for Water and through the environmental land management schemes. But as I say, we have a good working relationship with the OEP. We will respond to the report within the statutory timeframe that we're obligated to do as a department within that 3-month period.
Well, I'm very glad you've got a good relationship with the OEP. I'm sure you have. Glenys Stacey is a very very good person, and I'm sure that relationship is very good, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the data that we have in front of us points to the fact that the government's action is largely off track, and I'm very glad to hear you've done some work since then, but I think everything we've heard in the committee this afternoon suggests that there are big flaws in the way that the regulatory system is working. I mean, we've heard, for example, that untreated sewage has been pumped into English waterways for over 3.6 million hours last year. We had the example of the Windermere Lake. Yes, I was talking about what went into it, the effluent that went into it, the pollution, the sewage that went into Windermere for 13 hours before the Environment Agency got there. We are one of the richest countries in the world, and we can't swim in our water, and increasingly we can't even drink it without getting sick, because we've just heard today warnings in Devon that people are having to boil their drinking water after 22 cases of diarrhoea there. So I would just put it to you, can you put your hand on your heart and say that the current legislative and regulatory framework in place in England is the best available to deliver improved water quality?
Well, I absolutely can say that if you turn the clock back, we did not have the Environment Act. Now, that was a huge piece of legislation that was brought through with huge positive mechanisms that were encompassed within it, not only to enhance the regulatory format in which government was held to account in terms of the measurables that they were bringing in and their levels of investment and the objectives that we as a government wanted to achieve, but also our plan for water, which I've referred to. I've gone through the levels of investment, the stronger regulation and the tougher enforcement that we're bringing out, all of which has come into place under this administration, of which we are going forward at speed, bringing out further measures through the likes of making changes just this week to the reforms to the bathing water designations, which will help us improve and hold those who pollute to account. But we are going at speed, whether it's quadrupling our Environment Agency inspections, responding to the challenges that were quite rightly put to us that involved United Utilities through the Panorama programme. We're rolling out a whistleblower platform. We're banning wet wipes. We're improved our monitoring programme, which all gives us the data to be able to allocate resource, which not only the the regulator in Ofwat will be scrutinising the £100 billion that's been allocated by water companies over the next review period. But things like us taking a catchment-wide approach through the 35 million that we're allocating to the River Wye action plan, and us wanting to go further in taking that catchment-wide approach when it comes to improving water quality.
I would simply say that if we look at the outcomes rather than the measures that you're talking about, the outcomes are still a very, very long way from the ones that we need. And I would just suggest that there is questions about that regulatory framework that still need to be addressed in order to be able to produce the kind of water that I think people in this country need and deserve.
Thank you, Caroline. Well, I think that concludes our session. This is a subject which has been focused on by the committee a great deal. I think we've heard a lot of things today which may lead us to wish to write to Minister with one or two points, not so much clarification of what you've said, but suggestions and recommendations of how progress can continue to be made in the reign of this Parliament and beyond. Thank you for joining us today, Robbie Moore and David Hallam. Order, order. Thank you very much indeed.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.